Chapter 931. Published at 7th of June 2022, 12:30 and 33 seconds p.m. Chapter 931. Rumors: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 931. Rumors: metal spirit. The heartbeats of Isoltine, the other elders and even Ingnerl in the distance all skipped at once. But even then it was especially so for Ingnerl. Ingnerl had assumed that Lionel couldn't be a very powerful crafter because the scanners didn't detect even a pseudo-spirit, let alone the complete one he was seeing now. So, to him, the appearance of this metal spirit meant something far different than what it did to the others, and his heart couldn't stop trembling out of control. He has a spatial treasure that can store life. Ingnerl forced himself to calm down. For one, there was the matter of Lionel's background. If he had such a treasure, that only confirmed Anya's words as more than just nonsense a mischievous little girl was spewing to help someone they saw as a friend. In addition, it was also possible that this was Lionel's ability. The one thing their scanners didn't test for was ability index. If they did so, it would cause an uproar, so they had no choice but to make such a concession. Some forms of beast-taming ability indexes also evolved such that their users could have inner worlds to maintain and nurture their creatures. So he knew he shouldn't jump to conclusions. However, when that greed bloomed, it became difficult to suppress. Especially when the metal spirit before him was more valuable than even most spatial treasures of that caliber. Lionel ignored those around him, a bright smile blooming on his face. "Hey little guy, how was your spa day?" Bloop. Bloop, Lionel chuckled. Usually he would have little Tali on his wrist. But after the segmented cube evolved, it gained the ability to nurture spirits as well. So he had been leaving little Tali in there. In truth, Lionel felt a bit bad after neglecting little Tali for so long, so he had been spending a lot of time communicating with the little guy, especially during the dimensional cleanse trial where he didn't really have much to do anyway. So, the two were much closer now than they had been back when Lionel had left him for 2 years. Of course, it wasn't exactly Lionel's fault that had happened. But little Tali was still in his infancy stages. You couldn't exactly tell a baby why it was logical that their parent had left them, right? The result was Lionel being especially doting toward little Tolliver now. So cute. Anya all but squealed as she watched little Tali turn into all sorts of shapes and sizes. Lionel smiled but didn't say much of anything. "Alright little Tali. Let's go." Bloop. Little Tali shot out from floating above Lionel's palm like a speeding bullet. In one instant, it was before Lionel, and in the next, the little guy was hovering just past the 3-meter mark, dancing about with a childish flair. Sometimes little Tali would take the shape of a star, sometimes something as random as a baseball bat, and other times it would even become creatures. The little guy's favorite creature to imitate was definitely little Black Star, so it would often become an adorable little silver mink, its whiskers twitching about as though to mock its foe in his absence. Lionel didn't restrict little Tali's freedom or adventurous side in the slightest. One would have thought that this would impede his control, but even as little Tali flipped between whatever images came to its mind, the little one still hovered exactly at 3 meters without strain to either Lionel or itself. Pada Oviel, with just a casual beckoning of his finger, little Tali came back, hopping up and down in the air as though asking for praise. The elders and Anya watched in astonishment as Lionel actually pet the little silver mink without a care for his hands. Anya would have screamed out to say something, but she too was a bit in shock that Lionel had passed the test so easily. They suddenly realized right then that Lionel wasn't bluffing. If not for the Tier 3 cap, how far could he go? Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. As the tests blazed by one after another, even the likes of Elder Isoltine had to admit that they had provoked a monster. Back in the 3-pillar galaxy, planet Luxnix had entered an odd state as though a fog was beginning to hang over them. Odd rumors about matters from decades ago began to circulate. Even now, the matter was still quite slow and subtle, no one daring to offend the Luxnix family with too much brazenness. But every time it seemed that those rumors would be smothered, the fire seemed to be rekindled elsewhere. Though the Luxnix family was still unable to confirm it with absolute certainty, they were smart enough to begin guessing that someone was definitely targeting them. Rumors in and of themselves weren't a big deal. However, the larger the family, organization or guild, the more they would have to worry about such things. One only need to look toward the example of Camelot to understand why. When it came to the dimensional verse, even a false story when spread wide enough could come to life, let alone a story many thought was plausible or even probable. For the Luxnix family that placed such an emphasis on purity as a result of their lineage factor, such a story of impurity circulating around could even begin to subtly weaken the power of their bloodline. Such a thing was far more serious than it seemed, to the point where the Luxnix family would easily become irreconcilable with anyone who dared to spread such a thing. But what would they do if everyone felt it was true? At that moment, there was a group of young men indulging in the fine dining planet Luxnix had to offer. It was said that the unique air of this world allowed women to grow up to become more beautiful, so they were quite famed for their gorgeous waitresses and hostesses. This reason alone was enough for countless young men, even from other noble sixth-dimensional families, to flock toward this location, especially after finishing a hard mission. Among these group of young men, there was a particularly one by the name of Asen, the very target of the first of Richard's plans. He chugged his beer grandly, leering at the perky bottoms of a passing waitress before leaning forward toward his group of friends. "Have you all heard those rumors?" he whispered with flushed cheeks. Right then, a figure dressed in leather armor and wearing a black mask casually entered the same restaurant. Author's note: there will only be 2 chapters today. A headache has gotten the best of me. There will also, unfortunately, be no chapters tomorrow. I will be back the day following with 4 chapters. It's about time we get to the meat of this volume. Chapter 932. Published at 7th of June 2022, 12:30 and 32 seconds p.m. Chapter 932. 10% faster if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 932. 10% faster. The moment the young men around Asen heard his words, their expressions twisted. Whenever this fool got a few shots of alcohol in him, he always forgot about everything else. They were quite literally in Luxnix territory, all while having lunch in one of their more famous restaurants. This was the worst time to bring up a scandal like this. As young nobles of their families, they had been trained in etiquette and personal brand and safety since they were old enough to put their clothes on by themselves. Among those lessons was the care they needed to take when out in public, especially when there were so many flies with ears buzzing around. Who knew how many young masters had had their lives ruined by being overheard by a pretty waitress? The truth was that they weren't meant to be there to begin with. The moment such rumors started floating around, Asen's elder brother had strictly banned his young buffoon of a younger brother from coming to planet Luxnix to begin with. However, it was exactly this ban that made Asen want to come all the more. The current Asen was followed by 2 youths, one of which was from First City but wasn't an heir candidate. The second was also from the First City, but was the son of a vassal. Their names were Maul and Willith respectively. The moment the words fell, both Maul and Willith's necks snapped in a particular direction. But what they saw allowed them to sigh a breath of relief. The waitress whose bottom Asen had just been leering at seemed too far away and also hadn't reacted to the words. This set their hearts at ease. Maul waved a hand, causing a thin barrier of force to appear around their table that was nearly completely invisible to the eye. This was part of his ability, but it was slightly different in comparison to other energy shield abilities of the like. "Asen, please watch your words." Asen snorted. "I can't ask questions?" He took another chug of his beer, his cheeks already turning rosy. One would have thought that his alcohol tolerance would be far greater with how burly he was. But a secondary look would tell you that Asen was far less burly than he was just chubby. He was just quite lucky in the fact that his frame was quite large thanks to his lineage. But rather than filling it out with muscle, you could probably cut him open for a few pints of beer if you were so inclined. Maul and Willith sighed in relief, thinking that Asen was going to lay the topic to rest. But when he sat back up from swinging his head back, Asen's gaze seemed more fiery than ever. "You two don't remember?" "Probably not, actually. I don't really remember either. I've just heard my brother talk about her a few times. I've never seen Gradier take a liking to anything." "You guys know my older brother? He's a stone-faced statue. If it wasn't because I've seen him a few times in the bathhouse, I'd think he was stoned down there too. But when it came to that woman, his eyes always used to light up like 2 gems. You could say that he's an outright simp, a simp of epic proportions, a simp to end all simps. He's actually pining over a woman that apparently let a country bumpkin put a baby in her. Ha! I can't stop laughing." Maul and Willith looked toward one another with pale expressions. Only Asen would dare to say something like this about Gradier. But luckily they had the barrier up and Asen's words were still vague enough that even if it wasn't, people wouldn't necessarily tie the 2 events together. Whenever Asen got like this, they didn't quite dare to stop him, not out of fear of Asen himself, but rather his elder brother. At the same time though, they didn't dare to join in either. What a joke, they still wanted their lives. And Gradier always seemed to have a method of finding out things other people didn't want him to figure out. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. So they remained silent. "Ha! That big brother of mine has always been so perfect, and yet he made such a mistake. I really can't stop laughing. It's too funny. Asen hiccuped, his awkward breath getting caught somewhere between a gasp, a heave and a burp. It was like the mouth equivalent of not trusting a fart. Only Asen could accomplish such a great feat, admirable indeed. In the end, what came out was a bubble of spit before Asen fell over in his chair. He hadn't even reached the ground before he was suddenly snoring so loudly that Maul and Willith almost felt the need to cover their ears. Maul shook his head. Waving his hand again, he dispelled the barrier and called a waitress over. He then used a connected service to book a room in a nearby inn. The owner of this restaurant had a stake in. He had flown in a shuttle with a drunk, bloated and burping Asen before. He refused to do it again. One such event was enough trauma for a lifetime. Plus, there was still some business to handle. Hours later, the sun set and planet Luxnix fell into darkness. With how the three planets rotated around one another, there was always at least one that was experiencing a bright day. This coupled with how frequent and easy travel between them was, there was no such thing as closing time for most establishments. However, this didn't mean that workers didn't have off shifts. It was right then that a particular young lady with a perky bottom accentuated by her tight, short skirt, waved her goodbyes to her colleagues and boss. She drifted out of the restaurant, a peculiar light in her eyes glowing bright after being hidden all day. Her steps were about 10% quicker than they usually were, and her breathing was also slightly shallower than normal. It was like she had an excitement within that could hardly be contained. And yet, all of that deflated the instant she chose to take a shortcut through an alleyway. An alarming feeling of danger gripped her as two figures blocked her path forward and back. Chapter 933. Published at 7th of June 2022 12:30 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 933. Young waitress, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 933. Young waitress. The waitress froze, her small frame trembling. She suddenly felt as though it was particularly cold despite the fact planet Luxnix had spring-like temperatures year-round. There was no surprise that the two figures that had blocked her path were Maul and Willith. Likewise, it was also no surprise that this young woman was the very same waitress with a perky but that Asen had been ogling at. Maul and Willith were too experienced with cleaning up Asen's messes to take a chance like this. At the same time, these waitresses knew well the kind of job they had. Not a single waitress picked out for such a high-end restaurant wouldn't be extremely beautiful, extremely skilled, and most importantly of all, extremely intelligent. A waitress might be a position many stereotypically looked down upon. But, the higher end the restaurant, the more stringent the requirements. At a certain level, becoming a waitress was not only exceptionally lucrative, but highly revered as well. Due to knowing such things, Maul and Willith had even come together, cutting off all paths of retreat and not taking a single chance. Even when this young woman began to shiver in fear, they didn't lower their guards in the slightest. It was possible that she really was so weak. But, it was equally as possible that she was a talent that surpassed the two of them. In that moment, without even waiting for any words to be exchanged, the two shot forward, killing intent thick in their gazes. Maul had already set up a barrier to block out all sounds. This one was even thicker than the one he laid in the restaurant. A vast energy coated Maul's palm as he struck toward her chest. A spark of lightning ran through Willith's irises as he too struck out, but toward her back. It was right then that the seemingly frail young lady sprung to life. She slipped out of her high-heeled shoes in one smooth motion and tore a line up the thigh of her pencil skirt, uncaring for the skin or undergarments she exposed in the process. What was her dignity if she couldn't keep her life? She knew exactly what was happening here. It seemed that her act in pretending not to hear a thing earlier hadn't worked. Or rather, maybe it had worked, but they still chose to cut away loose ends and not leave anything up to chance. It seemed that after a few years of working in the industry, she finally ran into her first life and death situation. But all hope wasn't lost. They were in the middle of the city. As long as she could find a chance to break through those barriers, the guards would be alerted and she would have a good chance to live. If this was Viola family territory, it would be helpless. But luckily this wasn't their arena to control. The young woman's body became as nimble as a panther's, her body taking a quarter spin to the side and arching out of the way of the two strikes. Maul and Willith's palms smashed against one another, missing their target. The resulting impact sent the woman flying toward a wall of the alleyway, something she took full advantage of. Her toenails seemed to grow into 2-inch claws, tearing through her black stockings and cutting into the wall to anchor her propulsion upward. Before Maul and Willith could react, she was already more than 10 meters in the air, her arm cocking back as her fingers also grew with claws, each one having their own metallic sheen beneath the twinkling golden moonlight. The young waitress' back was bloody from the impact of Maul and Willith's strike, her once tight shirt having been ravaged by violent force and her trickling blood. She could feel her vision swimming as she forcefully kept it together. Just the aftershocks of their strikes put her in such a state. Yet even without looking back, she could tell that both of them weren't injured even after exchanging blows like that. The difference between them was clear and obvious, at least in terms of defenses. This was her one chance. She had to break through this barrier. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. The young woman's eyes lit up with excitement. She had made it. Her claw ripped forward, coated by a menacingly sharp force. It tore through the energy barrier Maul had set up like a knife through butter. The young waitress' chest expanded as she took a deep breath. Help. Someone is trying to kill me. She roared out at the top of her lungs. She put so much effort into tearing through the barrier that she lost sight of the building before her. In the back of her mind, she felt that tearing through that energy wall had been too easy. She had put so much effort in the swing that it knocked her off balance, causing her to lose a chance at staying latched onto the tall walls. The young waitress found her falling back to the ground, her expression changing. She realized in that moment that she still couldn't hear the bustle of the city even after tearing through the barrier. There's more than one barrier. She realized in that moment that she had made a mistake. It wasn't that Maul and Willith couldn't chase after her, but rather that they didn't have to. In all likelihood, they were confident that even if she realized this earlier on, she would have been blocked and sent tumbling down by the second barrier. Who would have known that she would ruin herself before she could even make it that far? Despair sunk its hooks into the young woman's heart. She too had her own story. Who didn't? She thought that this would be her chance to take a step forward. But it seemed that she would be like so many who got snuffed out by the harsh realities of the world long before they got a chance. Maul and Willith's gazes locked onto her as she fell to the ground, hopeless to do anything. They brandished their palms again, ready to kill her in one blow. Until, they sensed a killing intent sharper than even their own. Before the two men could react, a shadow had appeared between them, catching the young waitress who had accepted her fate out of the air. The masked shadow swept an indifferent gaze toward the two of them. Chapter 934. Published at 7th of June 2022 12:30 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 934. 8 of 12 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 934 8 of 12 Maul and Willith felt a deep sense of fear for some reason. They didn't even register that this shadow was a woman until they breathed their last breaths. Maybe it was only then, when they could finally release their worries, that they could notice something so meaningless. The battle lasted less than 100 exchanges and there were even some points they believed they might be able to win. But the rate of improvement the masked shadow underwent was far beyond their expectations or anything they could handle. No, it wasn't improvement. It was as though this shadow was adapting their already ridiculously strong combat capabilities to counter the two of them specifically. It was the most shocking feat of battle they had ever seen. Even in death they couldn't help but admire it. The sound of two bodies falling to the ground resonated as the masked shadow finally put the young woman down. Thank you. Thank you. The young woman bowed deeply. Even though her back had been torn open and was still bleeding, she still took the effort to properly bow. The masked shadow, who was obviously none other than Aina, nodded lightly. In her hand she brandished a spear, much different from her usual battle axe. But it was hard to tell that if this was another training method to help her break through, or if she was just trying to hide her identity. If Maul and Willith had known that they died to someone not even using the weapon they were most comfortable with, who knew how they would react? Seeing that gratitude of the young woman, Aina nodded lightly before vanishing. Her mission had already been complete. In truth, she was supposed to follow Asen around until he slipped up and could be pinned with the crime of spreading false rumors by the Luxnix family. But this was just the third day and he had already failed so epically. Richard knew that Asen had his elder brother's followers cleaning up after him, so he had sent Aina here to interfere with their cleanup duties. The fact that Maul had put up such a convenient barrier only helped her out. The battle had been more difficult than she thought it would be, though. The two might have been from the first city, however they were under the umbrella of their families. Only when you became junior general would you be assigned to a city based on your own strength. This was to say that a junior general from City 6 like Samson was far stronger than a youth without a title formed the first city. But it was clear that Maul and Willith had been refraining from applying to become junior generals so that they could continue to protect and clean up after Asen. If they applied now, Aina guessed that they would either be elites in City 6 or even mainstays of City 5. They weren't simple characters indeed. But that also meant that since Asen's elder brother, Gradier, dared to send them here without worrying for their dissatisfaction, his true subordinates were far more powerful than this. It seemed that the competition of heirs was ramping up as they slowly reached maturity. The closer they got to the sixth dimension, the closer the elders of the past generations would be toward having to make a final decision. And now, Richard had thrown down the gauntlet. The young woman watched as Aina vanished, the sounds of the city entering her ears once more. She looked toward the dead bodies and panicked slightly before regaining her bearings. One part of her wanted to go home and forget that any of this had ever happened, but she was much smarter than this. She knew that the fact Aina had come here to save her was not a coincidence. This was definitely planned. Now, even if she wanted to, there was no way out of this. If she really went home, she bet it wouldn't be long before Aina appeared before her again. And if that happened, rewards she could have monopolized for herself would probably end up in someone else's hands. Gritting her teeth, the young woman made her resolve. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. It was exactly like this that a small character set rolling the events that would embroil 3 planets into chaos. Asen snored away like some sort of big baby. The bed he rolled about on was easily enough to fit half a dozen people comfortably, and yet he somehow managed to go from edge to edge without much effort. The smell in the room was absolutely foul despite how high-end and luxurious the accommodations were. Unfortunately, no amount candles and incense sticks could match the fog of alcohol, vomit and shit stain-inducing farts. However, it was exactly then that Asen's dreams came to an abrupt end. Bang! The heavy oak doors of the hotel room flew off their hinges, shards of splintered wood sprinkling through the air and falling to the ground. Asen, no matter how much of a deep sleeper he was instantly awoken. Fear, shock and confusion colored his features. It was clear that he had no idea what was going on. He had just been in a land of dreams when he suddenly heard a lot of banging, shouting and roaring. If it was just a battle, that would be fine. But it felt like all this noise was being aimed at him? What had he done? What the hell? At that moment, a middle-aged man wearing tight, white leather armor walked in. He had a 12-pointed star radiating a delicate light on the left of his chest and 2 beautifully embroidered feathers on both of his tall collars. To his waist, an exceptionally thin sword could be found. So thin, in fact, that one might not even be able to tell that they had been stabbed until it was far too late. Asen's expression changed and the fog of his mind finally vanished when he saw this middle-aged man. It was as though a bucket of cold water had been poured over his head as he was stunned awake. This uniform could only be worn by the most elite guard of the Luxnix family. While the Viola family had vassals, the Luxnix family had Featherstar warriors and this man actually had 8 of his 12 star points illuminated. Asen didn't know what he had done, but he knew that it was serious now. Chapter 935. Published at 7th of June 2022 12:30 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 935. Try if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 935. Try bind him. The middle-aged man said coldly. Asen's expression changed. What is the meaning of this? I am a seed of the Viola family's main bloodline. You can't do this to me. The middle-aged man hardly reacted to this realization. It was clear that he was perfectly aware of Asen's identity as the young waitress had reported this. This was part of the reason why they had sent someone of his stature to deal with such a thing to begin with. The Feather Star warriors of the Luxnix family were not a joke. They were an elite guard that rarely, if ever, saw the light of day. They were split into 4 tiers. Starless, 4-point, 8-point and 12-point. Of course, this ranking system was based on the most famous symbol of the Luxnix family, the 12-pointed star. Not many knew or understood the secrets behind the symbol or how it related to the snowy star owl, or if it was related at all, but what they did know was that the Luxnix family would be willing to go to war to protect its prestige. To be a 12-point Feather Star guard was the absolute highest honor and such trump cards rarely left the family grounds. But this could even be said for the Starless guards as well. The fact that an 8-point Feather Star guard was actually sent here was enough to show just how serious this matter was and how furious the Luxnix family was about these circulating rumors. Asen wasn't able to resist as he found his wrists and ankles chained. His combat prowess wasn't very high to begin with, so how could he be a match for such elite warriors? The entire city fell into silence as Asen was dragged away. The number of eyewitnesses were so numerous that it was impossible to hide, and maybe the Luxnix family didn't want to hide it. At the same time though, those that had a guess as to what was happening didn't dare to say a word. There was a saying on 21st century Earth that said what appeared on the internet would always be there. It was just a way of letting everyone know that there were some things that couldn't be taken back and it wasn't so easy to erase the truth. However, were things still so simple when the technology in question was far beyond that time? What if the government had absolute control? What if there was a powerful existence that could decide your life and death on a whim? Maybe in those cases, it wouldn't necessarily be impossible to shape and change the truth. Unfortunately, the Luxnix family wasn't on its own. There were two other families with its level of strength in this region, and one of them was already targeting them. This was just the beginning of a brewing storm, and the one who started it all, Richard, was nowhere near the destruction. Across the dimensional verse, back in a galaxy far weaker, on the surface that is, a group of elders sat in abject shock, unable to gather themselves. It felt like every test they gave Lionel he passed with just enough to reach a Tier 3 standard. And yet, it was done with such ease that it couldn't have been more obvious to them that his skill was beyond just this. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Even though Anya was also shocking in her own right, completing the Tier 1 trials with a steady and sweet smile on her face, they had already expected as much from her. But this Lionel came out of nowhere and even seemed to have more skill than many of them. The truth was that Lionel was only truly being held back by his designation. Due to his weak dimension in the past, his finger speed, dexterity and strength couldn't keep up with the rest of him. The only reason he had even been able to forge bronze treasures back then was thanks to his metal body. Unfortunately, though it gave him strength, it didn't give him the corresponding dexterity and flexibility now, though those shackles had been shattered. Lionel's hand speed was at a superior grade 1 designation for the bronze grade, granting him perfection. Lionel also felt that if he used star fusion, he could even push past this to a silver grade designation. In the end, there was no fault Elder Isoltine could find. Somehow their small branch had gained another Tier 3 bronze crafter, leaving them at a loss for words. Even their best crafter, an older man who was currently not present, was only Tier 4. Right behind him was Isoltine, but she was only Tier 3. Just like Lionel. They truly didn't know how to wrap their heads around this. One had to know that in the guild, status wasn't based on seniority or family power. It was all based on skill. In the blink of an eye, Lionel suddenly had the same level of authority they all did and also had the same amount of say. He had gone from someone who could be blocked at a gate to an existence that could directly kill a guard for even daring to think of doing such a thing. Done? Lionel asked. His expression didn't look like he had done anything particularly impressive. In fact, he looked quite calm and relaxed. In truth, as he had been undergoing these tests, he had been thinking more about what Anya had said to him as opposed to anything else. He felt that she was definitely correct, no matter what her motives were. He couldn't enter every situation bracing for hostility, then be shocked when that was exactly the energy he received. And even when he still received hostility in return, who knew if he was just meeting someone who was as jaded as he had once been? In that case, shouldn't he also give them a chance to change their tune like he would? He needed friends and allies right now, not enemies. He was well aware that he couldn't do all of this alone. If his attempts still failed in the end, at least he would know that he tried. So Lionel smiled. Miss Isoltine, I noticed that pendant around your neck has a bit of damage on it. How about you let me take a look, free of charge? Take it as a gift to a fellow crafter. Lionel smiled warmly. Isoltine suddenly found her old heart skipping a beat. Chapter 936. Published at 7th of June 2022 12:30 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 936. Not a big deal if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 936. Not a big deal. Isoltine snapped out of her surprise, subconsciously shaking her head. She had been so annoyed with Lionel all this time that she hadn't noticed until just now that this boy was quite handsome. Wait, what was she thinking? She was old enough to be his grandmother's grandmother. She had grown out of the swooning over pretty men stage a long time ago. Though there were still some faint lines of beauty on her aged features, definitely above average for a woman as lived as her, she wasn't under the illusion that she could still attract men with her looks. At least not men who weren't at least as old as she was, that is. But even those old bastards would prefer to chase after youthful swan meat. It was quite the double-edged sword. As a crafter, Isoltine's thinking speed might not match up to Lionel's, but it was still far greater than most. This was usually a good thing, but at the moment she felt like she had overthought something as benign as a smile. It was embarrassing to the point her cheeks flushed slightly. Of course, this flushing had little to do with her attraction to Lionel and everything to do with the embarrassing train of her thoughts. After all, as she had told herself previously, she had long since grown out of such a stage. However, before she could regain her bearings, she found that Lionel was before her, his hand having already reached out to lightly grasp the pendant that had hung from her neck. In that moment she found herself frozen again. This time it was because of two things. For one, Lionel's scent was unique. It wasn't masked by cologne and felt fresh and natural, and yet it still held an edge of intoxication to it. The best thing it could be likened to, for lack of a better comparison, was fresh paper. When one entered an office, especially one that had large printers blasting at full tilt all hours of the day, the first few whiffs of that new paper smell was almost drug-like. Isoltine felt that Lionel's scent was like this, but it was far more layered, complex and fragrant. But at the same time, it wasn't as overpowering nor was it as easy to get over as the smell of paper. The second that shocked Isoltine, though, was that Lionel actually dared to get so close to her without warning. Maybe if she still had that same hate for Lionel, she would have slapped him to death for doing such a thing. Or maybe if he wasn't so nice to look at or smell, she would have reacted in that way even if she had a good impression of him. But for some reason she just froze, her gaze locked onto Lionel's fingers as they twirled her jade pendant between them. Compared to Lionel's face or his scent, Isoltine found Lionel's hands to be the most enticing. She couldn't take her eyes off of them. They were slender and well-kempt, but they also coursed with veins that traveled up his forearm. Their beauty was beyond anything she had ever seen, and the longer she looked at them, the more she felt her chest being taken over by a searing heat. By the time Isoltine realized that there was something wrong with her actions, a flash of silver covered Lionel's hands for a moment before retreating. Lionel lowered the elder's pendant back down, careful not to touch the skin of her chest before taking a step back. "You." Isoltine's was going to speak before her pendant began to glow lightly. At that moment, a gentle green energy wafted out from it, pouring into her skin and coursing through her veins. In just a few circulations, Isoltine's cheeks seemed rosier, her skin less wrinkled, and she felt as if her energy reserves had been replenished 3 times over. Visit Riedel. Me for extra chapters. In just a few minutes, under their astonished gazes, her age regressed by at least 5 years. Though she still looked like she could be a grandmother, it was now to the point one might have to ask her just how young had she had her first child to still be so youthful. Isoltine was stunned. He actually repaired it? What Lionel didn't know was that Isoltine had won this pendant at an auction about 10 years ago. It was made of a very precious jade known as revitalizing jade. Much like many other precious ores, revitalizing jade came in several grades, and this one just so happened to be of the bronze grade, allowing it to have great effects on helping a fifth-dimensional existence to retain their youth. As one might expect, it was extremely expensive. It took trading off decades, centuries even, of hard work for Isoltine to get her hands on it. And even then she only managed to succeed thanks to the fact this was an incredibly small piece and the fact it was sold damaged. If it was so easy to repair, Isoltine would have done it herself long ago, or the auction house would have taken those steps long before they decided to auction this piece off. And yet, it took Lionel a brief moment? What kind of exaggerated nonsense was this? The jade around her neck now was easily worth 100 times what she paid for it. This amount of wealth dangling from her neck almost made her want to forego youth and sell it off again. Was this really just a gift? No matter how stone-hearted Isoltine was, she couldn't muster up the same hatred she had before. In fact, what happened before couldn't even be considered hatred, it was more like annoyance. It was just that in her position, when someone or something annoyed her, the results would be devastating for them. "Thank you." The words sounded so foreign rolling off her tongue that Isoltine flushed red again beside herself. This Lionel was truly the bane of her existence. Lionel just grinned. "It's not a big deal. A metal spirit is especially good at forging small, intricate parts and is also excellent at repairing items. It was just a small task." Chapter 937. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 937. Question: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 937. Question: Isoltine's mood and attitude seemed to shift on a dime. Quite frankly, rather than being shocked, her colleagues were more jealous than anything else. As crafters, they understood the value of her jade pendant quite well. But after Lionel also extended helping hands to them, their tunes couldn't help but change. Before Anya and Engnarel understood what was happening, the 5 of them were happily chatting about their crafts, completely forgetting that there was a certification exam going on. If not for Engnarel clearing his throat and excusing himself, who knew how long it would have gone on for? Ro, Agnero walked out of the guild house shaking his head. He really didn't know what to make of this day. He had some crafting experience of his own and he had never seen a youth as talented in this aspect. Even Anya, who had gained acknowledgement of that person, couldn't match up. Though it was clear that Anya was also holding back, Lionel did the same with far more elegance and ease. The gap between them was as clear as day. Still, Agnero felt that much of this gap could be explained by their familiars. A metal spirit was just too perfect for crafters. Though it couldn't be used across disciplines like a flame spirit, for example, within its niche, it was untouchable. As for Anya, though she had a great background, she only had an ordinary flame spirit. Agnero shook his head. There was nothing normal about having a flame spirit. His perspective had been twisted by Lionel to the point where he forgot that Anya's flame spirit was the first he had seen in his lifetime. Beyond that, even if Anya could get a metal spirit, not just anyone could control one. As far as Agnero knew, they were incredibly dangerous, which was what made it even more shocking that Lionel didn't even use force crafting gloves. Just what kind of monster is he? Agnero shook his head, putting his greed away. He didn't have a death wish. Even if he could defeat Lionel, what about his backers? The fact that everyone who came here had to be registered was a double-edged sword. He couldn't just erase information that Lionel had been here. And, because of that, if something happened to Lionel, it wouldn't be long before he and the other elders became suspects. By then he would be finished. Plus, if Anya was correct about Lionel's origins, let alone him being implicated, his entire family and even the guild itself might be eradicated because of him. He had no intentions of getting embroiled in such nonsense. Agnero shook his head for the third time in just as many minutes. At that moment he suddenly got another message from his tablet. This time though the gears and force arts that ran across its surface shifted, forming the emblem of an organization Lionel recognized all too well, Shield Cross Stars. This wasn't a very surprising development, at least not for Agnero. The truth was that the security of worlds like this one were often left up to Shield Cross Stars. After all, they were the universe's police force. At the request of powers, they could take root at your borders and give a layer of protection you wouldn't otherwise have. The concept was similar to someone on Earth buying a security service and planting their emblem in their front yard for all to see. Sometimes, the fact that there was a certain level of security to begin with was more important than the security or its level itself. Roe, this was mostly a route taken on by guilds and merchant hubs, while organizations, kingdoms, families and empires usually handled their own security. Though there would always be exceptions. Of course this came with a fee. But for the Force Crafters Guild, it was negligible. Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. As for Agnero himself, he worked for Shield Cross Stars and could be considered to be a hired hand of the guild. As such, though he answered to the guild directly, those orders could be overruled by Shield Cross Stars in some circumstances. He had been tasked with Anya's safety by both the Force Crafting Guild and Shield Cross Stars. So, the seriousness of this charge couldn't be underestimated, which was why he had been especially sensitive to Lionel's arrival. Even now he hadn't forgotten his job. Hours ago he had ordered a detailed background check for Lionel. But, he had already expected not to find much of anything. If Anya was right about Lionel's identity, he didn't have the cachet to access information on those higher-order families and organizations. So he had fully expected to receive an access denied. But when he looked down to casually accept his fate, he froze instead. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Lionel smiled, looking toward Anya, who was observing him curiously behind her veil. She seemed to be trying to look into his mind. The two walked through the hallways of the guild house, heading toward the treasure house. Though they had yet to build up any merits, in all their gratitude, the elders and Isoltine had given 1,000,000 guild points to Lionel directly. Lionel had no idea if this was a lot or not, but he still accepted them enthusiastically. It seemed that being kind no matter the circumstances came with its own perks. Anya blinked. My mom said to avoid men who were too charismatic. Lionel's lip twitched. First he was too mean, but now he was too nice? Maybe he should have been used to the difficulty of pleasing women by now. He couldn't help but sigh as his mind wandered to Aina again. All right. Lionel suddenly thought of something he had meant to ask Anya before, but it felt inappropriate to do so. You said that only the ignorant would say what I said about family names. What did you mean by that? Is it not possible for others to be called Morales? Lionel felt that there was something off about that. Morales wasn't exactly a unique family name on Earth. Chapter 938. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 56 seconds AM Chapter 938. Like you do if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again Chapter 938 Like you do Anya blinked, checking over Lionel to see if he was being serious. Before, she had thought that Lionel was just trying to be cheeky. After all, someone of his standing should be well aware of the reason. But she was confused to see that Lionel was actually serious. Was he really not from the Morales family? No, that didn't make sense. Metal spirits rarely submitted to anyone outside of members of that family, and little Tali seemed far too obedient. Plus, she could sense a strong Earth variant affinity coming from him. Anya shook her head, not minding it anymore. The higher level someone is, the more unlikely it is for them to share a name with such a powerful family. The fifth dimension is already too high for you to still be able to casually call yourself Morales without truly being from that family, especially since you're so young. Why though? Well, just the same as the future can influence that past, the inverse should obviously be true as well. In fact, though that much should be intuitive, it's even deeper than you think. It's more accurate to say that the past can change the future. Lionel's brows furrowed. He felt like he was back in school learning algebra for the first time. What kind of nonsense was this? It was both obvious and baffling at the same time. It was obvious that the past affected the future. But what did it mean for it to change it? After the past happened, wouldn't a set future decided by cause and effect already be set into motion? What did it mean to change it? If I had to explain it as simple as possible. If someone of your caliber appeared and shared the Morales family name, all while not being affiliated with them, it would mean that the destruction of the Morales family wouldn't be too far away. Well, it might not be so exaggerated. But the Morales family probably wouldn't allow it to happen. You'd probably have your own personal swarm of bodyguards coming after you. Lionel's expression became weird. How could any of this be considered an explanation? Actually, Anya tapped a finger to her veil-covered lips. If it was you specifically, it would definitely mean that the destruction wouldn't be far away. They'd probably even send a seventh-dimensional existence a step away from the eighth dimension after you. Anya kept babbling on and on as though Lionel should already understand what she was saying, but he was only growing more confused. And why him specifically? Why me specifically? Anya blinked and turned her golden gaze toward Lionel. Something about her felt far more profound than it had before, an odd, almost ancient force swirling about her. Because you're dangerous. For a moment, it didn't even seem that Anya was the one who was speaking, but rather someone far more aged and mature. Compared to the mischievous girl that Lionel knew, she was completely different to the point they could only be comparable in looks and nothing else. Lionel didn't know how to respond to this in the slightest. What about him was dangerous, exactly? He couldn't help but think back to the words his coach had spoken about and the backstory that connected him and Lionel. He still didn't know how those machines of Earth had concluded him to be a danger to society. However, Lionel believed he had come up with an explanation for this. Back then, Earth couldn't even properly categorize his ability because it could only properly read 5% of his DNA and was confused by the remaining 95%. Wasn't it obvious, then, that it could have misread him in this situation as well? This conclusion had helped Lionel to throw those matters to the back of his mind. He had always subconsciously ignored it, even to the point where despite always telling Aina everything, when it came to this he never did. Plus, hadn't he lived a perfectly normal life to this point? How could there be anything wrong with him? Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. So why was Anya saying this stuff now? Anya looked away and Lionel shook his head. He found this woman too difficult to read. He just needed to focus on healing himself so that he could more confidently take his next steps. It was about time he checked in on Elther and the Oryx. The guards of the treasure house were stunned to see two youths approaching, but they soon had no choice but to accept the reality. A duo of such youthful bronze crafters was something they had never seen before. This storehouse was shared between both force crafters and force pill crafters. It had shelves hundreds of meters tall and an eerily structured organization that made one think that someone had dedicated their lives to ensuring that everything would be perfect. Without much thought or a word toward Anya, Lionel found the section of healing herbs before he realized something especially intriguing. He didn't need to spend his guild points on these herbs. He just needed to use Dream Sculpt on them. That way he could save his points for ores he could use in the future. He doubted that this treasure vault would have the ores he would need for his next divine armor. But that didn't matter. He could do a lot with what was before him right now. He just had to be quick about it. The matters related to Anya had already been thrown to the back of his mind. It didn't take Lionel long to find several healing herbs with light elemental attributes. Though most were fourth-dimensional, there were a handful of fifth-dimensional ones. Each of these were worth hundreds of thousands of points though, something that truly put Lionel's million points into perspective. Lionel, who was about to get lost in his own world, was suddenly startled. His head snapped back, only to find Anya had once again appeared by his side. Wait, had she appeared there or had she never left? Now that Lionel thought about it, he wasn't sure of the answer to that. What are you doing? Lionel asked. Anya blinked. I have 0 guild points. I don't have a sugar mama like you do. She spoke as though this was the most obvious thing ever. Why wouldn't she follow him around since she didn't have points of her own to spend? Lionel was speechless. Last chapter of the day. Didn't have the energy to start writing the chaos that's about to ensue. LMAO. Chapter 939. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 939. Twinkling Bell Lily. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 939. Twinkling Bell Lily. This girl was truly too loose with her lips. When she wasn't saying things that made no sense, she was teasing him as though they had known each other for decades. She was really too difficult to get a read on, and Lionel also had a feeling that her veil was only making it more difficult. In the end, Lionel could only shrug. He had thought that Anya was coming with him because she had free reign over the items in this treasure house. After all, with how the elders treated her, likely due to her status, he had made certain assumptions. But it seemed that instead she was just stuck to him like glue, like a little girl chasing after her big brother. It reminded Lionel a bit of little Nana. He couldn't help but think back to that adorable little blue-haired girl. The trouble was that even little Nana was far more mature than Anya. Lionel found that his experience in the Valiant Zone had made him far more stoic and level-headed. Even when he had been with his brothers, he hadn't joked around with them as much as he usually did. What he couldn't tell was if that was a part of him maturing, or if he was just becoming jaded. Of course, he could turn his charisma on and off like a faucet, but was it really the same if he had to consciously act like that? It felt somewhat robotic. How many people could have heard Anya's advice about being too scary and immediately change on a dime? Maybe Lionel was the only one. But a product of that was the realization that he was a bit too good at artificially producing his personality. Something like that made it difficult for him to tell who the real him was. Was he charismatic because he wanted to be and that was just the type of person he was? Or was he just abusing his emotional intelligence to get what he wanted out of the world? Lionel shook his head again. It felt like Anya's presence was forcing him to introspect. It was an uncomfortable feeling. But if there was anything Lionel was good at, it was stonewalling those kind of things. In one moment he had a pensive look in his eye. In the next, it vanished with a calculating light, scanning the array of light elemental healing herbs before him. Anya's irises twinkled with something imperceptible. But she stood obediently to the side, her sweet fragrance hanging in the air with a strange magnetism. Lionel, though, didn't seem to notice, his mind completely focused. As beautiful as Anya was, to the point where Lionel was certain if she removed her veil she wouldn't lose out to Aina in the slightest, there was still only one woman who could ever distract him from a task at hand. And Anya wasn't that woman. All the like herbs are here. Convenient, I don't even need to move. There are 38 variations of herbs in the 4th dimension. There are 3 variations for the 5th dimension. A 4th dimensional mage art might be useful if I want to mass heal a large group of individuals. But my priority right now is forming the most powerful healing spell I can muster. I need an herb that not only matches the light element, but it also needs to be one that is compatible with Snow Force so it can synergize well with the healing branch of my Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. If those are the parameters I set, then there are only 3 of the 4th dimension that fit and only 1 of the 5th dimension. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Lionel ignored the 3 4th dimensional herbs for a moment, training his eyes on the 5th dimensional one he felt responded the best to his Snow Force. By all measures it was quite a beautiful herb. It had the 6 petals and delicate bell shape of a lily. It was a gorgeous white color and had veins of white that would even sometimes spring to life, dancing above its body for a moment and sprinkling down a heavenly light before going to rest once again. It had a long stem that attached it to 3 other companions identical to it. However, what was curious about this long stem was the fact it was covered in a white fur that waved about as though it had a life of its own. However, even this was just the tip of the iceberg. Amidst the 6 petals, coming out from the center, several stamens that seemed shaped of pure gold metals sprung upward. On their ends each of them held a twinkling gold bell. Every time the flower swayed, These bells would release a delicate sound that tickled the ears, filling one with warmth. Or rather, that's what would have happened had the twinkling bell lily not been enclosed by a glass case. Lionel didn't waste much time, immediately beginning to dream sculpt the twinkling bell lily. The root of this flower's artistic conception seems to be the ringing bells. Even its name says so. But I feel like the fur covering its stem is actually just as important. This beautiful plant is actually a bit carnivorous. No wonder it resonated so well with my snowy star owl lineage factor. It might be more beast than plant. Lionel didn't know much about force herbs. After all, he wasn't a force pill crafter. However, combining the dictionary and his dream sculpt allowed him to understand an herb far better than even an expert herbologist would. How fascinating. Lionel had come looking for a force herb that could replace Grand Heal. But he had never expected to find a combination heal attack mage art like this. If he shifted it to a light earth elemental mage art, the results might be even more shocking. However, for now, Twinkling Lily, Bell's Blessing. At that moment, Lionel's eyes snapped open, his body beginning to glow with a fierce light. Chapter 940. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 940. Be careful if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 940. Be careful. Right then, Anya's eyes widened. She had been wondering what Lionel was doing, but when she saw the result, her golden irises were completely filled with shock. At that moment, a lily manifested around Lionel, a strong surge of light elemental force causing the surrounding winds to pick up and surge. The sound of delicate chimes resounded, the golden bells dancing above Lionel's head. Every time they swayed, a sprinkle of golden light fell upon him, attaching to his skin and sinking into his body. Without a word, Lionel cast this spell 17 times before he finally exhaled a breath and gripped his fists, his body finally feeling light again as he expelled the last of the black ash that had been inside of him. It took 17 casts and 70% of my stamina just to heal from one split-second usage. This innate note of mine is really the bane of my existence. Lionel shook his head and chuckled. Though he had seemed fine all this time, he really only had about half his usual strength. He could only function normally thanks to dream sense dulling his pain. This Twinkling Lily series of mage arts I've come up with aren't bad. The Bell's Blessing only has about 20% of its max healing potential, but it still did so well. Should I find some Star Force healing herbs that could be used with my Vital Star Force? Lionel thought for a moment before he shook his head. His Vital Star Force was too precious and took too long to replenish after he used it. It was best to reserve it entirely for using Star Fusion at a critical moment. As for why Lionel had only used Bell's Blessing and not the full version of Twinkling Lily, that secret was rooted in the hidden carnivorous nature of the Force herb. He felt it wasn't appropriate to test the mage art's capabilities here. Lionel moved on without a word after dream sculpting the 3 fourth-dimensional Force herbs. He had already decided which fifth-dimensional ores he would use for his metal body, so he didn't need to think about it. Though his merit points weren't enough to trade for a ton of fifth-dimensional Force herbs, ores were a bit different in this regard since they were sold in quantities of kilograms. At the very least, he should be able to get enough to take a first step into and solidify his stance in Tier 1. Anya was so stunned she forgot to follow for a second. Did he just... She looked from the twinkling bell lily to Lionel's disappearing back and back again. She was certain that spell. It had given her the same feel of the plant right before her. How had he done that? How was that even possible? It took him 10 minutes? Maybe? To create a technique that could be passed down in bronze organizations for generations to come. Anya picked up her dress and dashed after Lionel, catching up quite quickly considering he wasn't exactly sprinting. She continued to look at him as though he was some sort of monster, following closely behind. Fifth-dimensional star core will still be my foundation, upgrading from fourth-dimensional. I'll replace refractive gold with dancing lantern ore, and I'll replace blazing night with a more volatile fuel type ore in devil's shavings. Oregon. Lionel still felt the star core was the best foundational ore for him. Dancing lantern ore worked similarly to refractive gold in that it could consume and concentrate the light elemental. But, whereas refractive gold was dangerous and could turn even a benign ray of sunlight into a deadly attack, a property that made Lionel's sniper rifle especially dangerous, dancing lantern ore was very docile. Dancing lantern ore could accumulate the light element to the point of saturation. Once it reached that point, its internal structure would begin to move and shift, thus the dancing part of its name. This dancing wasn't just an optical illusion though. Once it reached this state, it was possible to choose one of two paths. The first was a steady output of power and the second was an immediate and violent burst that would put even refractive gold to shame. This made this or quite good for armors, shields and the exterior of vessels, or the body of weapons. Roe, finally, Devil's Shavings or was like a nuclear bomb in comparison to Blazing Night Oregon. However, much like its weaker counterpart, it was able to maintain a steady and relatively safe form in its complete form. Only after it was chipped, and its shavings were introduced to flames would it cause a catastrophe. It didn't take long for Lionel to find what he needed. He wasn't stingy and directly spent all million of his points and was even lucky enough to gather enough ores to enter Tier 3. Of course he would need to be patient and couldn't enter it directly. However, it was possible to use the silver tablet to loosen and erase his bottlenecks before moving forward. But something told Lionel that he couldn't casually bring that tablet out just anywhere. So he would need a secluded place first. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Anya remained silent as Lionel picked out his herbs, but the light in her eyes seemed to dim somewhat as she did. If Lionel had been paying attention, he might have even been able to notice that she sighed as well. But he had grown accustomed to ignoring her completely so that he could focus his mind. Only after he was finished and stored his things away did he finally look at her again. Where will you go now? It can't be that you'll follow me home, right? Lionel asked with a smile. Anya pouted. What would be wrong with me doing that? Are you trying to get rid of me? Lionel's lip twitched. He was indeed trying to get rid of her. He had things to do, he couldn't drag someone he barely knew around with him. Though he had to admit she was a pretty good shield. Thanks to her, things had gone far more smoothly than he thought they would. Just as Lionel was thinking of something to say in reply, a light lit on Anya's wrist, causing her playful expression to come with a touch of cold. It seems I have to go, she said lightly. Her voice was just as enticing as it always was. But, for some reason she seemed 10 years older without aging a single second. Oh. Lionel blinked. Be careful then. Anya's brows rose at Lionel's choice of words. She opened her mouth to say something before hesitating. You be careful too. She finally said. This galaxy isn't as simple as you think it is. Your ambitions might let you down. Lionel's brow furrowed. What do you mean by that? My ambitions? The birth of just a single planet of a certain caliber is enough to change the destiny of an entire galaxy. I'm sure you're smart enough to understand what that means. Lionel's pupils constricted. But before he could ask more, Anya seemed to vanish right before his eyes. It was like he was both aware and unaware of what was happening at the same time. As though she had both always been there and never been there. What? Lionel suddenly realized that he had no idea just how strong Anya was. Before he could even think any further, he felt several strong auras sweep through his surroundings. He didn't even have a chance to figure out what was going on before they all locked onto him. Lionel realized in an instant that their intentions weren't kind, but at the same time he was confused. He was still in the guild, how could he be targeted like this? And for what reason? Author's note. It seems that I'm bad at predicting chapter lengths as usual, LMAO. The action starts tomorrow? I guess, DKM. Chapter 941. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 941. Status: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 941. Status. Lionel took a look around and sighed. If those auras could kill, he probably would have exploded several times over by now. He didn't believe that Anya's disappearance was a coincidence. But he also didn't think that she was involved in this. It was likely more accurate to say that whoever was moving in on him now had been waiting for exactly this moment. It seemed that his protective charm was gone now. They're not moving? Lionel's brows raised slightly. After locking onto him, these hostile auras didn't seem intent on moving in on him just yet. It was as though, they don't think I can sense them? Lionel suddenly realized something. He described this sweeping feeling as auras, but the truth was that they were just strands of internal sight. This was clearly different from an aura, so why was it that he felt that this was an appropriate description? Beyond that, how could he tell they were hostile? King's might. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He understood that this grasp of auras, artistic conception, the emotions and mental states of those around him, that he had were all related to this lineage factor. Whether it was his creation of new mage arts or a comprehension of a person's mental state all the way up to even being able to influence another's opinion of him, it all stemmed from this. I see. So they think I'm unable to sense them. Lionel almost chuckled to himself. Though as a crafter he definitely had strong internal sight, Those that were targeting him right now likely believed that his control was far greater than his raw internal sight. They believed that even if they couldn't match him in control, the quality of their internal sight should be beyond his since they were stronger. As such, they didn't need to worry about being detected. Another possibility was that these people were completely unaware of his level to begin with. After all, they seemed to be cautious about acting on the guild's grounds and were likely waiting for him to step out. In that case, they might not be related to the guild at all. Not related to the guild? Targeting me? Waiting for an opportunity? It's either the Milky Way Guild or Shield Cross Stars. But the Milky Way Guild wouldn't dare to be so brazen. I would dare to assume that over half of their profit is reliant on force crafters and force pill crafters. Offending someone who just became a Tier 3 bronze crafter isn't something they would dare to do, at least not so openly. So, Shield Cross Stars finally caught up to me, huh? Well, they sure chose a nice time. Lionel looked around. It was a shame. If it was the guild targeting him, he wouldn't have minded sweeping this treasure house clean. But he had already decided not to burn down bridges unnecessarily. Lionel concluded his deductions in a split moment, his expression never changing. Those who were currently monitoring him would never guess that in just that second, he had already guessed who they were, knew of exactly where they were, and understood their purpose. Well, since it's like this, maybe this could be an opportunity. And Lionel slicked his hair back, rolling his neck as he stepped toward the exit of the treasure house. His face didn't seem to give anything away. His gait was casual and his expression carefree. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. When Lionel stepped out of the guild house, he was greeted by the fresh scent of this world once again. Long stretches of green grass, perfectly paved roads, little pockets of exotic flowers and fish ponds. It was quite a beautiful sight to behold. Lionel's bare feet glided across this grass, his sweatpants having been rolled up to his calves. By this point he had even removed his shirt, revealing an exceptionally cut body that pulsed with a bronze life and vitality. To the current Lionel, wearing clothing into battle was just asking for them to be destroyed. There was only so much the silver chain dangling from his neck could do about it. He seemed to be meditating as he walked, his body entering an odd state. Lionel allowed his king's might to be the lens he saw the world through. It gave him the feeling of someone riding an emotional high, completely in tune with the world surrounding him. It was then that the alarms of the world began to sound. High above in the skies, 3 warships came into view, each about 20 meters from tip to end. They had a sleek black exterior and a platform upon which 3 men wearing a very familiar uniform stood, long robes split into 4 at the waist, allowing the metallic leg armor they wore to shimmer beneath the sunlight every time the wind blew. And most importantly, a star fused with a cross hanging from their lapels. Lionel smiled lightly, his eyes half closed. Those uniforms are still so cool. A pillar of light connected the hovering ships to the ground below, projecting a force art onto the ground. The moment the force art was burned into being, several squadrons of Shield Cross Star officers appeared at the guild house gates, taking up formation with those who had already taken position at the helm. Lionel didn't recognize most of those who took the front position, but there was one man that made everything click for him. It was none other than Ingnarel. At that moment, Ingnarel stood a respectful half-step behind a man who seemed to be a few years younger than him. By now, Ingnarel had already switched into Shield Cross Star's signature uniform. Seeing such a lineup, Lionel realized that the charges that Sai, the person in collusion with Era, had levied against him were not small in the slightest. These people didn't know the origin of Lionel's charges, nor did they understand that he was being framed. All they knew was that Lionel had colluded with a variant invalid, evaded arrest, and most importantly, was a Tier 3 fugitive, a status that was high enough to warrant him being hunted down by the entire galaxy. Chapter 942. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 942. Sai, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 942. Sai, evacuate the surroundings. Tier 4 fugitive Lionel Morales, stop all form of resistance. The voice came booming, but it made Lionel raise an eyebrow. Tier 4? I thought that previous guy said that if I wasn't handed in within 2 hours, I would become a Tier 3 fugitive. It seems that never got the chance to take effect. Lionel had no idea how lucky he was that this was the case. In fact, it could be said that Scythe was only using this as a threat to force Earth's hand. The threshold between a Tier 4 and Tier 3 fugitive was the difference between this matter being handled by an individual galaxy or pulling in the forces of others. What did this mean? It meant that up to Tier 4, one's fugitive status was still relative to the strength of your galaxy. But, the moment you stepped into Tier 3, you would be the target of all Shield cross-star branches across the dimensional verse. It could be said that the moment Lionel stepped outside of this galaxy, he would be a free man. But, with how difficult it was to travel between galaxies, how could they believe that it would be a simple matter for Lionel to do so? And even then, where would he go? All this said, being Tier 4 was also equivalent to being among the most wanted of a galaxy. And the amount of vitriol pointed Lionel's way spoke volumes about this. Lionel's palm shifted slightly, causing a beautifully crafted wooden spear to appear in his hand. It was carved of a deep black grain and it was continuous with its wooden blade. It was clear that the whole thing had been cut out of a single piece. Though Lionel hadn't said anything, his actions were clear as day for all to see. The laziness in his eyes seemed to vanish, his gait still steady as he walked toward the gates. Ignaro frowned. He had felt that something was off about this matter from the very beginning. The fact that Lionel was able to enter such a world without an alert going off in the first place was ridiculous. Then there was the fact it took hours to get back to him that this Lionel was actually a Tier 4 fugitive. If the system was always so terribly slow, then how would they protect the people? It all smelt of someone trying to cover up and protect Lionel. But now that the truth was out, he couldn't just stand idly by, right? The wind pressure of the hovering ships pressed down, flattening the stretches of grass and causing the ponds of water to ripple wildly. Lionel's own hair danced about, its short strands giving him a sort of carefree air. I'm quite disappointed in Shield Cross stars. Lionel suddenly spoke. Despite not having the same amplifiers his enemy did, he still managed to cut through it all. His king's might didn't seem capable of being suppressed, even by volume. To accuse an innocent man without evidence, trial or proper proceedings. Is this the so-called protector of the universe you all claim to be? Lionel decided that he might as well try to talk. But he couldn't take an approach that was too soft either. The holes in this charge against him were too numerous. He colluded with a variant invalid to attack his own planet? The very planet he was technically in line to potentially inherit? Then, when he was going to be punished for his actions, his grandfather, the ruler of said planet, still chose to step out to save him. From top to bottom it made little sense. Just a little investigation would tell anyone this. So, Lionel knew that he couldn't take a casual stance with this. Anyone with half a brain would understand that there was something wrong. However, just in case, he still chose to say something. Visit Riedel. Me for extra chapters. Unsurprisingly, he didn't receive an answer. The younger man Ignaro stood respectfully behind, raised up a hand before pointing two fingers forward. Captain Snyder? Ignaro spoke softly. However, a side glance from the younger man was all he needed to stop his words in their tracks. Sometimes the truth wasn't what mattered. Ignaro's gaze narrowed. If they were going to offend Lionel, they might as well offend him all the way. There were no chances for half measures. In that moment, a squadron usually led by Ignaro shot forward. They were usually tasked with guard duties on this world. In fact, amongst them there were two very familiar faces in Rio and Xander. It was no surprise that these two had the most sinister expressions of the lot. While the others were simply doing their duty, it clearly meant more to them. They no longer wore their flashy, golden, diamond-encrusted armor. The change made their auras sharper and far less of a joke. It seemed that they did have some skill beyond being lackeys to noble men and women far above their station. But, did it matter? Lionel sighed lightly, his body stretching. He felt a bit stiff after just healing from so many injuries, but with as much emphasis as he placed on his flexibility in training it, it wasn't long before he felt light and limber. The group of 5 had already cut the distance between themselves and him. Should I kill them? Lionel sighed again, shaking his head. Forget it. They'll just decide depending on the situation. Lionel suddenly found 2 spears piercing toward him at once. He looked down at them, meeting the hostile gazes of both Rio and Xander. Before their blades could even pierce through his exposed abdomen, the situation changed. In an eruption of ash, their weapons crumbled to nothing. They continued forward in a piercing motion, but without their spears, they stabbed at empty air, making it seem like more of a comedy routine than the instigation of battle. A light glow coated Lionel's black wooden spear. Before the two could react, their arms flew into the air in a rain of blood, their cries of agony filling the skies. Chapter 943, published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 943, Pumping Blood. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 943. Pumping blood. Rio and Xander slid along the grass, gripping at their armless shoulders with the only hand they had left. Pain was etched across their faces, a mixture of surprise and horror hiding within. Lionel might have needed a few exchanges to defeat a usual Tier 4 existence since he wasn't using his sniper rifle. But who asked Rio and Xander to use the exact weapon that was completely useless against him? Lionel swept a gaze over the three remaining members before checking the surroundings once again. It seemed that the guild house was quiet, almost too quiet. A part of that was because they hadn't allowed many people in to accommodate Anya to begin with. But another part was likely that Shield Cross Stars had already warned them all to stay out of the way. I should get out of here as quickly as possible. I don't have the luxury of using this for training. Who knows if they have more reinforcements coming or not? Lionel didn't want to fall into a trap of overestimating himself. As confident as he felt right now, it was exactly at such a point that he was the most vulnerable. His gaze turned cold, a dull fog of violet hanging around him as though to curtail the world. Lionel's steps shifted, a road of star force appearing in his path as he appeared amidst the three remaining warriors. Harmonic Spear. Lionel's sweeping spear left several afterimages in the air, making it difficult to tell just which trajectory was real and what was fake. The three warriors were immediately overwhelmed, blocking what they thought was real only to end up pushing their weapons through fake images. Before they could react, they found their bodies being torn into, Lionel's spear force slicing their flesh like a hot knife through butter. As expected of a tactical unit, they were so focused on being a part of a team that none of them got the chance to use their abilities before it was too late. Without a chance, they could only watch as their blood sprinkled upon the greenery, dyeing it crimson. Lionel's head suddenly tilted to the side, a whistling projectile streaking just by his head. In the distance, an archer's pupils constricted. He had been certain that Lionel wouldn't react in time. He had even shot the moment Lionel was most confident in his victory. And yet, Lionel seemed to swerve out of the way in a motion that was almost too natural. Lionel swept his spear toward his right hand, his left palm flipping over to reveal a sniper rifle. Before anyone could react, he fired. Bang! A look of horror froze on the archer's visage. Despite standing on a building over a kilometer away, there was no room for dodging. In the split second he hesitated, shocked that Lionel had actually dodged, he had already sealed his own fate. A line of gold tore through the skies, shooting through several discs of reflective gold before landing on its target. Though the range was too far for anyone to get a feel of just how bloody the end result was, a sinking feeling still sunk into the pits of their stomachs. Lionel put his sniper rifle away in a motion just as smooth as the one he had used to bring it out. He had figured that there were likely snipers casting a net around him, but they clearly had their own methods of concealing themselves even from Lionel's internal sight. In that case, he could only wait for them to expose themselves. The moment they did, they could consider their lives forfeit. Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. Lionel rose his now free palm, spreading out his fingers and arching them toward the ground. In that moment, the metallic leg sleeves of the 5 warriors groaning splintered into their numerous pieces, rising up into the air and circling around him. Lionel had realized that this piece of their uniform was actually extremely valuable. Not only did they use 5th-dimensional herb ore as a foundation, but each was constructed of an extra unique 5th-dimensional ore that he guessed must match the affinity of the officer that wore them. It was clear that the wealth of Shield Cross Stars was beyond Lionel's imagining to be capable of doing this. So he had no qualms about taking advantage. Engnarl stood a half-step behind Captain Snyder with a solemn expression on his face. Was this the combat prowess someone at Tier 1 should have? Or was this the fearsomeness of crafters? As though to answer his question, little Tali appeared like a river of silver, floating around Lionel as though it had become some sort of enigmatic shawl. In the blink of an eye, all the metals were swallowed up by the metal spirit, causing its size to expand. All units forward! Captain Snyder roared. The guild house grounds were suddenly flooded. Lionel counted that there were almost 100 of these ground units. And, unlike the group he had met in the Milky Way Guild, they were trained to work together and most definitely wouldn't get in each other's way. However, Lionel didn't seem to have eyes for them. Instead, his internal sight was still locked onto those 3 floating ships whose pressure had still not let up. Namely, his senses were locked onto the 3 men, 1 for each, that stood at the helm. Their hands were clasped down to their backs, their expressions not giving anything away as they observed the battlefield. Lionel's lips suddenly curled, his heart rate increasing as he continued to observe these 3 men. His smile became a grin, his gaze tinging with a bit of red as his aura blazed, the temperature in the surroundings skyrocketing to the point despite there being no flame, the grass in the surroundings still turned to ash. Lionel's blood pumped, his pale violet eyes gaining a brighter hue with every passing moment. A pillar of flames suddenly erupted as Lionel shot forward. He appeared before the first of the warriors in less than a single breath, his spear piercing forward. Meteoric impact. Chapter 944. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04:52 AM. Chapter 944. Best ad. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 944 Best ad. An eruption of fire turned whatever blood and gore there would have been to ash. In that moment, a headless corpse fell to the ground, much of its shoulders and collarbone burnt to black. Lionel's fingers flickered, causing another pair of metallic leg sleeves to shoot to little Tali. His feet glided past several attacks, his left hand continuously tapping in the air. The speed of his fingers was so fast that concentrated blasts of air would arc downward every time he struck. It was as though he was playing the piano on the back of the wind, his veins pulsing with an undying power. Meteoric impact. Whenever Lionel got even a semblance of breathing room, the rhythmic tapping of his fingers would come to a halt and his spear would pierce out like a spiraling fire dragon, shaking the air and imploding the head of yet another warrior. Every time one died, another set of metallic leg sleeves would be added to little Tali and the rhythmic tapping would grow faster and somehow more controlled and deliberate. The snapping of Lionel's fingers became so fast that the sound barrier began to shatter with every tap. The speed was even beyond what Lionel could casually reach within such a strong world. Lionel sidestepped, allowing a pike to pass between his ribcage and elbow. He swung his arm down, pinching the polearm onto his body and twisting. A resounding snap caught the warrior off guard. Before he could realize that Lionel had targeted a weak point in his weapon's craft to shatter it, an elbow glowing with bronze runes was already traveling toward his face. The sickening sound of shattering bone resounded through the already rowdy battlefield. Meteoric impact. Lionel's visage had entered a state of cold excitement. He was hardly thinking about his next action before he took it. He subconsciously felt that he didn't need to calculate things in a battle of this level. And the result was his entering a state of free-flowing where his spear domain lineage factor took charge. A blinding golden spear appeared on his forehead long before anyone realized what was happening. Then, without even considering the consequences, Lionel applied a spear technique to his elbow. Bang! The head of the warrior imploded. This time the explosion was much less controlled as compared to what it usually was with Lionel's spear, resulting in a tail of wild blackish-red flame to jet outward for several meters, catching a wave of warriors off guard. They hurried their force to block, but the heat was excruciating, some of them even feeling their skin being boiled in real time. Unfortunately for them, Lionel instinctually took advantage of this as though a predator stalking prey. He appeared in their midst, his harmonic spear activating. He stood amidst the flames, allowing them to trickle across his exposed torso. Yet, it seemed to hardly affect him in the slightest. The confusion of fire, screams and countless spears covering the surroundings left the warriors at a loss for how to react. In the blink of an eye, half a dozen fell to Lionel's spear, never to rise again. Lionel released a roar that shook the skies, his hair and gaze slowly gaining a crimson hue to them. His flames only seemed to become more powerful with each passing moment. Now, every time his finger tapped at the air, a ring of fire would spread out from it, turning the lush greenery of the guild house into a land of black ash. In that moment, little Tali finally rose high into the skies, pile after pile of herb were falling to the ground. With just a single look, it was possible to see hundreds of kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb or an amount that was practically a fortune to anyone who wasn't a crafter. However, it was still continuing to pile. In just a few minutes, little Tali had separated out the metallic leg sleeves to their fundamental components, effectively undoing all of the crafter's work. Just like that, several oars shaped into perfect javelins appeared. They looked like large needles, each 3 meters long and each being thicker toward their center and tapering out to their ends. Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. Infernal Cyclone. Lionel's spear began to spin in his hands. Every revolution it completed formed another wheel of fire that jetted out with his spear as the center. Some of these wheels of fire were vertical, some horizontal, some diagonal. They ravaged Lionel's surroundings so thoroughly that trenches dozens of meters deep were torn up. Scatter! One of the warriors roared. Lionel didn't pursue even as his infernal cyclone, ravaged the warriors around him. Instead, his spear vanished, his right hand stretching out to his side. As though it had a mind of its own, one of the 6 javelins little Tali had just completed fell into his palm, its aura completely changing as though Lionel was its one and only master. Lionel's stance shifted, his right foot rotating to the back and his left anchoring his front. Deep, semicircular lines followed the path of his soles, his back flexing and his chest expanding as he cocked the javelin back. However, what shocked those around him the most wasn't the fact he had completed several bronze-grade crafts while in the middle of battle, nor were they surprised that he had used their own equipment to do so, nor was it even that he dared to use such untested crafts with his life on the line. No, none of that was surprising. What shook them to the core was that his gaze had suddenly locked onto the ships floating in the air. The fiendish grin on Lionel's face only seemed to grow wilder, his muscles bulging to the point every individual fiber could be seen. He, Lionel Morales, was a decent sniper. He guessed that he was also alright at using the bow. But, if there was a form of marksmanship he was the absolute best at, it was most definitely throwing. Bang! Lionel's body shot out like a loaded spring. The sound of the javelin leaving his hand was no different from an iron ball leaving a cannon. Even the earth beneath his feet shattered, sinking downward what was at least half a meter. The javelin drew a line through the skies, whistling wind and concentric circles of shattered air spiraling in its wake. Without anyone being able to react, it tore into the hull of the leftmost flying vessel before the world fell into silence. A moment later, chaos ensued. Chapter 945. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 945. Ablaze if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 945. Ablaze the javelin tore through the hull of the leftmost ship as though a hot knife through butter. There wasn't an ounce of resistance and the hole it created wasn't even visible to the naked eye. It felt like nothing would happen for just a few moments and many almost sighed breaths of relief. As scary as Lionel was when he wielded a spear, whenever he became a marksman, it felt as though they were all standing in the presence of a demon overlord. It felt that no matter which of them he chose to lock onto, they would die without recourse. Unfortunately, they never got a chance to breathe that sigh of relief. That javelin wasn't bad. I think it combined a few lightning and water elemental ores. This will probably be the slowest acting one. 3, 2, bang, bang, bang. The nonchalant man who stood at the helm of the ship almost lost his balance, his hands unable to remain clasped at his back. The chain explosions his ship was undergoing only became worse with every passing moment. In that moment, another javelin had already appeared in Lionel's hand, causing the atmosphere to shift once again. The pupils of the 2 remaining nonchalant men constricted, their hands already leaving their backs as their auras surged. However, what they hadn't expected was for Lionel's second throw to still target the leftmost ship, something that most definitely caught the man at the helm off guard. But what happened next made them regret not stopping the javelin at all costs. The ship suddenly swayed, its explosion sending it careening into the middle ship. It was as though the explosions were perfectly crafted by Lionel to result in this. There was nothing they could do to stop the chain result. The moment the left and middle ship collided, a spiraling implosion resounded, only for Lionel to throw out a third and fourth javelin that resulted in the both of them colliding with the rightmost. The explosions were so loud and endless that even the long-since evacuated residents could hear the commotion from hundreds of kilometers away. The skies sparked as though a network of fireworks had been let free. The clouds were singed black and ash rained down along with meteors of fiery metallic parts. Lionel stood amidst the destruction, his expression unmoved. From start to finish, a second archer hadn't dared to target him, probably for fear of ending up like their other comrade. For some reason, even when Lionel was the most distracted, it felt like his vice grip was still holding onto their necks. As for Lionel himself, he felt like lava was rushing through his veins. He knew that the battle was over now. He could just hop into the segmented cube and use its new functions to leave this place now that there was nothing that could immediately pursue him. But he still longed for battle. In that moment before, he had almost aimed the javelins at the men standing on the helms despite knowing just how stupid that would have been. Lionel shook his head. Using dream sense, his raging battle intent was dulled as it split between over 1,000,000 minds. In an instant, he regained all his rationality, the slight red tinge of his violet hair and pupils vanishing. Little Tali descended, wrapping itself around Lionel's wrist. As for the remaining 2 javelins, Lionel stored them away before summoning the segmented cube. Lionel swept a gaze toward Ingnerl and Captain Snyder, causing both to tense up. Boy! A roar sounded from the wreckage. Lionel had never expected his javelins to kill those three men, and clearly they weren't feeling just a small bit pissed. Too bad he didn't have the intention of sticking around. Visit Me for extra chapters. Maybe had they attacked with the original group, things might have become troublesome. But, since they had chosen to attack as though they were lofty and above everything else, they only had themselves to blame for the result. The segmented cube shifted, its numerous jigsaw-like puzzle pieces expanding and contracting until it reformed itself into a black ship made of the same pieces. This ship pulsed with blue lights, looking as though it might collapse at any moment. The crevices between the puzzle pieces were clearly visible. Though it gave it a beautiful, exotic sort of look, it was also difficult to tell whether the vessel would actually hold up. Lionel, though, felt that if he couldn't trust this ship, then there was no ship in the world worthy of his trust. Halt! Lionel cocked an eyebrow. Was he actually supposed to listen to that, or? Lionel shook his head, stepping into the ship. Soon, his vision was filled with a complex series of control. Puzzle pieces hovered in the air in odd patterns before surging toward Lionel, covering his fingers. In that moment, Lionel's nerves were fused with the ship. The only thing they didn't share was pain. It felt as though he had gained a whole new body. Just the sensory overload alone was enough to overwhelm a normal individual. Lionel shook his head. Even for him it was hard to handle. After all, this ship was at a sixth-dimensional standard. But it was also ironically a perfect way to train his mind as well. Just riding this ship to come to the guild's world had helped his mind improve by a few hundred split minds. The ship shot into the skies with such speed it felt like it simply teleported into the stratosphere. It was then that a massive, dome-like force art activated. However, it might as well have been a thin sheet of paper. It broke into tiny shards of glass, sprinkling down over the world as it trembled. They had hardly registered what happened when Lionel had already vanished into the distance, traveling at speeds that were hard to fathom. A silence fell over the guild world. It felt as though they had just witnessed history. The name Lionel Morales was practically burned into their minds. And soon, it would set a wildfire ablaze across the galaxy. Chapter 946. Published at 13th of June 2022 4:04 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 946. Crime pays if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 946. Crime pays. On a corner of the guild world, Anya sighed and shook her head. It was hard to tell exactly what sort of place she was in. All the walls were white and had a slight glow to them. However, there were no windows or even a door. The only thing in this room outside of Anya herself was a statue of a woman with a beauty that felt almost computer-generated. She was too perfect, without a single flaw and without a weakness. Whether it was the symmetry of her face down to the ratio of her hips to waist, to her bust and bottom, even the individual strands of her hair. It was all immaculate. This statue radiated an aura that Lionel would find familiar, having sensed it once before in his life. However, even to someone who had never sensed it before, they would feel the need to bow and prostrate themselves before this woman. All this said, as difficult as it was to tell exactly where Anya was, deciding what it was she was sighing about was even more difficult. At that moment, Anya's bracelet rang once again. She bowed toward the statue and took a step toward the blank walls, vanishing as though she had walked through an invisible doorway. "You're trying to encroach on my territory?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. This time, Anya was in a simply decorated room without an ounce of anything special to it. It seemed like any other luxurious hotel room, except for the fact this wasn't a hotel at all. There is no such thing as encroachment when it comes to the word of the goddess. Anya replied lightly. "How sanctimonious of you. It might not be an encroachment to you, but if I see any of your disciples, I'll kill first and ask questions later." "Is there a need to be like this?" Anya asked with a sigh. "I'm getting tired of that loftier-than-thou tone. It would do you good to remember exactly what it is your goddess represents. No amount of pure light and white clothing can wash your stains away. I've already given you my warning. Don't test me." Anya shook her head. Earth has already entered the fifth dimension. Their fold of reality has already expanded past just their solar system and has consumed a dozen others. At this rate, they'll truly be on pace to swallow the whole galaxy by the time they are prepared to enter the seventh dimension. This piece of the pie isn't something any one person can swallow, and to try to do so is a foolish dream. Your attempts to monopolize these gains for yourself will end horribly for you. There is a harmony that must be achieved. All Anya received in return was a sneer she could practically hear through the phone. You make stealing the territory of another sound so noble. People like you disgust me the most. The person didn't wait for Anya's response and simply ended the call. They had already given their warning, they didn't have the patience to say anything more. The longer they spoke with this Anya, the more they wanted to watch her head implode like a hammered watermelon. Anya shook her head once again and sighed. Lionel took deep breaths, beads of sweat falling down his brow. Much of this was from the difficulty of controlling the ship, but another large part was rooted in the fact he had entered that battle with just 30% of his stamina remaining. He had avoided using mage arts as a result for fear that he would be sucked dry before he could actually do anything. But this isn't bad too. We made a nice little profit. Lionel grinned. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Lionel thought of the herb he had gained. He had only taken the metallic leg sleeves of about 60 or so warriors of shield cross stars, yet he had gotten over 1,000 kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb out of it. It seemed that crime really did pay. Lionel had half a mind to target the shield cross stars offices so that he could build up the wealth he was lacking. But, in the end he decided against this. The current Lionel couldn't see the true depths of shield cross stars. Without fully understanding his opponent, it would be foolish to provoke them too much. At the same time, Anya's warning still lingered in his mind, making him realize that cornering this galaxy wouldn't be nearly as easy as he thought it would be. In that case he had to change his plans. He still needed resources and information, but how he would use them would have to change. I should also return to Earth since that's where the boys are. It's about time we regroup and make some moves. Lionel weighed his options and decided to put his other thoughts aside. He would return to Earth first, gather everyone up, then move forward. The chess pieces on the board were moving too fast. Lionel wasn't even at the point where he could see the whole board to begin with, but he was already being overwhelmed by a small corner of it. No, I can't return to Earth empty-handed. Also, the Milky Way Guild has yet to properly suffer for their actions. At that moment, a talisman lit up within Lionel's spatial ring. At first he was stunned before his mouth spread into a wild grin. Your timing couldn't be any better, Elther. Lionel's mind raced as it quickly memorized the information Elther was sending to him. A list of disaster planets, branches, and stores the Milky Way Guild owned were all systematically organized by Lionel. In the blink of an eye, Lionel had a grasp of much of the Milky Way Guild situation. Lionel wasn't naive enough to believe that this represented all the assets the guild had, but it was more than enough. In fact, he was surprised that Elther had managed to gather so much. That woman he's working with? Isn't simple. She knows too much. Who is she exactly? Lionel frowned for a moment before throwing it to the back of his mind. It didn't matter who this woman was. She might have all this information, but he would be the one to act on it. As they say, crime pays. Chapter 947. Chapter 947. Elder Lumine. In a particular room within the guild house, several elders could be found shaking their heads. Among them, there were the elders who had just given Lionel his certification in Isoltine. But at the moment, Isoltine was like a mama bear who had just witnessed her cub's tail being stepped on. Is this really what we're doing? You can just blatantly target one of our own now. Isol, that shield cross, I don't care who it was. Isoltine snapped. So anyone can just accuse our crafters as they please and then target them as long as their fist is large enough? Did you all forget that the guild has numerous branches just like Shield Cross Stars does? Why do we have to fear them? The lips of the elders twitched. Come on, Isol, you know we don't have the firepower to go against them. Plus, we have a symbiotic relationship. Oh, so you remember that too? How could they finish their fancy little uniforms without us? If we put our foot down and refuse to craft any more for them, what do you think would happen? On top of that, when has a crafter ever feared someone with power? We could have destroyed that whole fleet with a press of a button, but you bumbling buffoons didn't even let me go help little Lionel. Visit. For a better user experience, did you not see? They brought 3 enforcers with them. 3. Had you gone out, how long do you think you would have lasted? If you're a coward, just say so. Isoltine sneered. The elders looked toward one another at a loss for words. She was acting like Lionel was her grandson when they had known each other for all of one day. They couldn't even reason with her. And to make matters worse, we agree with Isoltine. It's one thing if Lionel wasn't already one of us, but not only is he also has our branch's emblem. Because you all forced us to wait for the guild head's approval, for all we know, his heart might have grown cold toward us. This guild branch was just one of many, not only in the dimensional verse, but of the Milky Way as well. There were dozens of branches across just this galaxy alone. They didn't particularly care about branches of other galaxies, but they were in constant competition with branches that called this place home alongside them. The addition of Lionel would have been a great help to them, even setting Isoltan's clear overprotection aside. When things were framed in that way, they were losing out not just face but also tangible benefits, all because they took a step back to shield cross stars. The elders that hadn't participated in Lionel's certification suddenly had ugly expressions. They had all seen how Lionel took just a few minutes to complete 6 bronze-grade crafts. Granted, those materials had already been processed, but if they used that as an excuse, they would really lose all face. What's all this commotion about? What the hell happened to my gardens? The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. An old man who seemed to have a foot in the grave but the mouth of a belligerent teenager strolled in. Despite his frail frame, his presence seemed to command the room. If Lionel had been there, it would have only taken him a moment to realize that this old man was a quasi-sixth-dimensional existence. Guild head. The elders respectfully greeted before Isoltine, as spitefully as she could, recounted the events. As he listened, the expression of the guild head only became darker and darker. Shield Cross Stars has a lot of nerve. The near growl of the old man made those who realized the complexity of the situation nearly faint. They all knew that the old man treated Isoltine like his own daughter and had for years. He was too easily influenced by her emotions. If she felt wronged, then he would seek out vengeance for this wrong. The issue was that there were still dozens of other branches. They couldn't speak for all of them. In fact, there were most definitely many among those branches that would purposely stand in opposition to them just so they would lose out on a talent like Lionel. The more this blew up, the more disadvantageous it would become to them, especially if they took too hard of a stance. Doing such a thing would give their enemies license to counter. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Don't worry, little Isol, our Golden Path branch isn't made up of pushovers. Ah! At that moment, an older man who sat in a corner to himself, not having participated until just now, suddenly cleared his throat. Seeing him finally about to do something, the others sighed in relief. Isoltine and Jakriak, the guild head, were like 2 highly combustible bundles of TNT. This older man, though without their status, had always been the voice of reason. Elder Lumine, please advise. An elder said quickly before anyone could interrupt. Lumine coughed lightly. We should toe the line. Going directly against Shield Cross Stars is inadvisable, that this doesn't mean that the only other option is to be in lockstep with them. Hold a ceremony to induct Lionel as one of our own. His name should appear amongst our crafters and as a member of our Golden Path branch. However, we also don't need to explain our actions to Shield Cross Stars. We are simply following the rules of our guild. We allow people in based on skill, not their criminal record. This way, Lionel will know where we stand and Shield Cross Stars also won't go too far. If they try to upgrade him to a Tier 3 fugitive now, this matter might blow up in their faces. Visit. For a better user experience at the same time, this will give Lionel free access to enter any of our guild branches without issue. If he's as smart as I believe he is, he will know what kind of opportunity that is and he will take advantage. If he plays this well, then the other branches will have no choice but to stand on our side whether they want to or not. Once he finished saying these words, Elder Lumine returned to his nap, leaving the other elders gazing toward one another. Important note, author down, if my wrists had eyes they'd be crying right now. I must have tweaked it sometime yesterday and not writing feels like I'm being pricked 1,000 needles. There'll only be one more chapter today as a result. I'm hoping it'll be better tomorrow. It doesn't seem like too bad of an injury. Chapter 948. Chapter 948. Another mad Lionel sat within his large pool of cleansing waters, allowing the segmented cube to drift in the depths of space. After reaching the 6th dimension, the size of the segmented cube inside versus outside had shifted once again. It used to be 10 meters in diameter whenever someone was inside during the first phase, then it went to 5 meters during the second phase, and now, having entered the 4th phase, it was the size of a palm even when Lionel was within it. This size made many things very convenient. The current Lionel was just taking a small rest, allowing his stamina to recover before he continued on with his journey. But it was then that something surprising happened. Lionel's palm flipped over to reveal a particular badge. This was none other than the certification badge Lionel had been given by the guild. It was a nice and heavy metal construction and weighed about 2 or 3 kilograms despite its small size. Earlier, Lionel had been disappointed because it lacked the spirituality a true certification badge should have. Lionel had seen a true, complete badge before when he had a crafting battle with Jack Bianala, so he could tell the difference. He had been fully aware that his badge was nothing more than a hunk of metal, until now. Lionel's brows arched in pleasant surprise before he suddenly understood something. Lionel grinned. So that's how it is. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. Lionel wasn't a fool, he immediately understood some things. It seemed that he hadn't been abandoned by the guild. It seemed that he had underestimated just how far a positive attitude could bring him. He hadn't thought that just a few casual words and actions would help the guild to take his side in this matter. He was aware that his father didn't like the Force Crafting Guild very much, but this was just a branch to begin with. Was there a need to make enemies out of them when, in all likelihood, they were no part of whatever had enraged his dad? This is a good opportunity indeed. Lionel's gaze flashed. It took him no more than a split moment to understand Elder Lumin's intentions. This makes a lot of things easier. Lionel shot up, a surge of water following him as he landed outside of the pool. Little Tali wrapped around his wrist on instinct, seemingly sensing that excitement was afoot. Lionel grinned. It's about time you enter the 5th dimension too, little guy. Bloop visit. For the best no_vel_read_G experience, Lionel did a quick check to ensure that little Black Star was progressing well before shooting out. The segmented cube morphed into its vessel form and Lionel tore a path through space. Disaster worlds were the foundation for sayings like opportunity came with danger. Though they came with the highest death rates, they were also the worlds that often had the most resources. Of course, a part of this was because there weren't humans around to constantly dig up their treasures. After all, the environment wasn't exactly conducive to such a thing. But another part was the volatile concentration of force leading to the birth of particular ores, and in some rare cases even some force herbs, that would be difficult to find elsewhere. Most of the disaster worlds the Milky Way Guild controlled were just 1 star. This rating meant that one would need to be at the quasi-5th dimension to survive. Planet Vincero had a 2-star disaster rating, meaning a quasi-6th dimensional existence would be needed to travel freely about it. Unfortunately for the Milky Way Guild, Lionel had no interest in 1-star disaster worlds. Of course, this wasn't because they couldn't have great resources, it was rather because he was aiming high to begin with. He wasn't a fool. He didn't believe that the Milky Way Guild didn't have a method of protecting their assets. Whether he could get away with sneaking onto their planets was unknown. But if he was going to get caught, wouldn't it be best to catch them off guard with a world that was more important to them? It took a few days, but Lionel finally made it to the solar system of his target world. Even from so far away he could feel the volatile surges. And even though he had come prepared, even now, if it wasn't for the difference in size, he would have a hard time telling which was the planet and which was its sun. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_G experience, Planet Solara. It was ranked in the top 3 among 2-star disaster worlds in the Milky Way. And it was a title that Lionel felt it had earned without even stepping foot onto it. Rather than having blue oceans, plain Solara had depths of magma and lava covering its surface. Rather than stretches of green and brown land, it had relatively cooled pieces of floating obsidian that took the place of Earth. Every once in a while, long arcs of explosive molten rock surged into the world's atmosphere, looking no different from solar flares. The planet was so bright that it was almost as difficult to look at as compared to any star. One would think then that the greatest danger of Planet Solara was in its heat, but this wasn't the case at all. Due to its special constitution, Planet Solara had a particularly large molten core, making its magnetic field both extraordinarily powerful and volatile. The good news was that Planet Solara was uniquely equipped to block radiation from its own star despite being so close to it. The bad news, though, was that Planet Solara was also uniquely equipped to produce its own radiation, making staying on this disaster world for extended periods of time a death wish even for quasi-6th dimensional existences. However, despite knowing all of this, Lionel saw this planet like a shimmering gem. He had learned to use his king's might to create powerful mage arts, and he had long since thought of using this same comprehension to perfect his 4 seasons realm. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_G experience, if he traveled to the core of this world, what natural force arts would he find? And how powerful would his universal force become if he used them as the framework to amplify his 4 seasons realm? This wasn't just a bid for resources. Lionel was going to flip the whole dimensional verse on its head. Chapter 949. Published at 16th of June 2022 10:31 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 949. Her destination? Her goal? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 949. Her destination? Her goal? Planet Luxnix entered an odd state. Regardless of their status, the capture of a main bloodline member of an opposing family would always be a serious matter. And yet, the Luxnix family had done so without hesitation and without warning. It was clear that of all the things the Luxnix family was, pushovers was not among them. Asen's true state wasn't as fierce as the Luxnix family's state though. He couldn't be said to be comfortable, but at the very least, his life wasn't on the line. He sat on the floor of a relatively clean cell, his hands and feet bound by chains. There was a single metallic toilet to the side and the empty tray in front of him had likely previously held food. Still, though he hadn't been roughed up, for a nobleman this sort of treatment might as well have been the worst of torture. This was only especially so for Asen. He couldn't see any pretty women. He couldn't eat the food he loved. He couldn't even have alcohol. It was inhumane. At that moment, there was a shuffle and large, clanking doors and grinding gears sounded. After a dull boom, the sound of footsteps echoed in a leisurely cadence. It was as though the person wanted Asen to stay in suspense for as long as possible. "It's you." When Asen finally laid eyes on this person, his heart couldn't help but tremble. In a lot of ways, he felt that seeing this person hit him harder than even being in the presence of a Featherstar warrior. The fact that this person was here let Asen know that there was no way this matter would end simply. The young man stood there with an indifferent expression on his face, his visage seemingly having been handcrafted by a god. He had exceptionally fair skin without a single flaw, his jawline was gentle but strong, and he seemed to radiate a dim golden light just with his presence alone. Gold hair flowed down the young man's shoulders down to the small of his back, equally golden eyes matching it in luster and brilliance. His body was wrapped in pristine, blemishless, white robes, a single golden belt of delicately sculpted feathers wrapping around his waist. As ignorant as Asen was about a lot of things, there were certain matters that even he wouldn't be in the dark about. One was the Featherstar warrior. He would immediately recognize one of them so long as they were wearing their uniforms without fail, even if he was in a state of lethargy like he had been previously. Another was the heir of the Luxnix family, the sole heir, a man without match or competition, Miguel Luxnix. And it was this exact young man who happened to be standing before his cell right this moment. Unlike the Viola family which was still deciding on its own heir, Miguel had already claimed his position long ago. In this respect he was without match or equal. Despite being several decades younger than Richard and Asen's brother, Miguel was already at the quasi-sixth-dimensional level. He might very well be capable of breaking through at any moment. The difference was like night and day. Miguel observed Asen in silence for a long while. The pressure of his gaze fell on Asen in waves, he couldn't help but tremble, his teeth chattering and his limbs turning cold. He found that just breathing alone was difficult beneath this man's presence. Without a word, Miguel turned and left. Asen almost wanted to scream in frustration. Shouldn't he have at least said something? Done something? However, despite feeling so frustrated, Asen didn't dare to scream out, fearing that Miguel would come out. Miguel, though, didn't spare Asen a thought. He locked the gears behind him, turning toward the guards at the entrance. Each of them looked toward Miguel with reverence as though he was a god amongst men. "There is a chance that something will happen within the next coming days. Stay alert," Miguel said evenly, the cadence of his voice almost able to lull someone to sleep. At that moment, an entourage was making their way to Luxnix territory swiftly. It was no surprise that this group was led by Gradier. Visit Rietel. Me for extra chapters. Gradier would have been a handsome young man in his own right, with short-cut black hair and starry violet eyes. However, he had the stern look of a man already in his middle ages. It dulled his looks quite considerably and left a permanent wrinkle on his forehead as though he was perpetually frowning. He was truly frowning right then though. He understood there was a very real possibility he would never see his younger brother again. Back within Viola family territory, in a particular section of an estate and within a familiar setting, a group of 3 women could be found. "You just came back, are you really going out again so soon?" Savon worriedly probed Aina. She had just disappeared for 3 days but had now been back for barely a short time before she decided to set off again. Though Aina hadn't come back injured from her last venture, knowing her, this would only make her go harder this time. It wasn't just a feeling either. After what happened almost a year ago now, Aina had become a person of very few words. Yet this time she had actually told them that she might be away for a long while this time. This made all sorts of red flags go off for Savon. Yuri's expressionlessly observed Aina, seemingly not certain of what to say for herself. Instead of replying to Savon directly, Aina shook her head. "He'll be back." With that, she vanished into the shadows, her control over her Abyss Panther bloodline becoming no different from breathing to her. In her mind, she went over her orders again and again, her gaze narrowing as a tinge of red took hold of her. She knew it was practically suicidal, but she still chose to do it without hesitation. Her destination? The Luxnix family dungeons. Her goal? Get caught trying to save Asen and somehow manage to escape. Chapter 950. Published at 16th of June 2022 10:31 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 950. Little Rat. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 950. Little Rat. Lionel timed his entry onto planet Solara using one of its lava flares. He trusted the segmented cube to withstand such pressure, though the pressure on himself was a completely different matter. He found himself gritting his teeth, withstanding the jarring impact. The segmented cube had never been great with defense, though it had great self-repair. Luckily, it seemed to have gotten better in this regard after entering its fourth phase, but it was all reliant on energy as opposed to its own physical ability. Lionel had a bit of a buffer for now in his use of the segmented cube thanks to the excess energy it had accumulated within the trial zone. This was what allowed him to use it at least for now without much worry. But if he kept running into danger zones like this, he'd run out sooner rather than later. Luckily, this disaster world was likely another good opportunity to absorb more force. Lionel quickly landed on a planet, a large distance away from any hubs. He also instantly used his light elemental force to vanish from plain sight, certain that there were maybe even more monitoring stations on this planet in comparison to planet Vincero. Lionel had no way of knowing for certain whether he had been caught already, but it didn't particularly matter to him. Compared to his stint on planet Vincero, he was even more confident this time around, especially since this planet was dense in the elemental force he was most confident in using. Putting the segmented cube away, Lionel took a step out onto the stretch of obsidian land. He realized that compared to the endless peaks and valleys planet Vincero had, planet Solara was fairly flat. Most of the terrain depressions and peaks were caused by tides of lava and magma. Surprisingly though, there weren't any volcanoes, at least not from what Lionel could spot at a single glance. My sneakers. Lionel shook his head, stripping down to the bare minimum. Eventually he realized that he had no choice but to be naked. That might have been bad news, but the good news was that this environment that would likely have made most at his level feel like they were on the brink of death felt like a spring breeze to him. Lionel took a deep breath, swallowing up the hot air in the surroundings. He couldn't help but feel that compared to his Scarlet Star force, the heat of this place was sorely lacking. Even though his bare skin was exposed and even though the soles of his feet were touching the scorching lands, he felt unmoved. This is good. Lionel nodded to himself. But I still need to be careful. Heat isn't the only danger of this planet. If Lionel was suddenly hit with a storm of charged particles, it likely wouldn't be more than a few days before he died. Luckily he had a contingency plan for this. Bloop. Little Tali was also unmoved by the heat, but this only made sense. The little guy was used to high concentrations of volatile heat while partnering with Lionel to complete crafts. In fact, little Tali wasn't only good at withstanding this heat, but was even better in insulating it, something that seemed counterintuitive for a metal spirit. With a thought, little Tali coated Lionel's body from top to bottom, turning the latter into somewhat of a metal man. Lionel shielded even his eyes, not taking any chances. He was confident enough in his internal sight to continue on in this way. In fact, in a lot of ways, his internal sight was more trustworthy in comparison to his eyes. Lionel felt a cooling sensation all over his body. He realized then that even without his fire elemental affinity, just his partnership with little Tali alone would make it quite easy to step onto this planet. Of course, Lionel didn't need little Tali for this. Rather, he was confident that little Tali could help him block against the radiation and volatile magnetic fields. As for the rest, that could be left up to him. With a leap, Lionel dove right into the lava, vanishing from sight as he swam into the depths of the world. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. If one could see him now, he would really look like a fish in water. With his earth and fire elemental affinities working as one, how could this world stop him from reaching its depths? It was truly hard to tell if Lionel had outstanding luck or if it truly was so terrible. The truth was that it was impossible for Lionel to have reached the surface of the planet undetected. He was simply too unfamiliar with the detection system such large organizations had in place, while on the other hand, these organizations treated these resources like their lives' blood. How could they possibly leave it without proper security? That said, at this moment, Planet Solara was focused on receiving extraordinarily important guests. Guests so important that even the hunt for Lionel had been placed on a slight hiatus. Guests so important that even Guild head Ovaltine had personally made an appearance to greet them. Everyone was becoming more and more keenly aware of the convergence toward the Milky Way. Silent plots that had been brewing for centuries, sometimes even longer, were slowly starting to bear their fruits, and instances like Anya were just the tip of the iceberg. The next coming decades would decide who it was would rise to the top, and who would find themselves wiped out by the annals of history. Amongst these individuals beginning to slowly make themselves known were a small group of young men and women, all of which had fiery red hair and charcoal black eyes. Upon seeing them, even Lionel might have had the immediate instinct to draw a line of connection toward the Brazinger family. However, they were lacking in the crimson eyes needed and also had auras that were far different. At their helm, a young man with shark-like teeth and breath like sulfur stood at almost 2.5 meters tall. The air around him warped simply due to the heat his pores almost seemed to constantly release. He took a deep breath, causing spiraling winds of fire elemental force to jet toward him, his jagged teeth glistening beneath the blinding red-gold lights. Bang! An eruption of fire circled around his feet, shattering the sturdy grounds of the guild house. This world is not bad indeed, Augustus. Despite being far younger, the young man didn't care and directly called the guild head by his name. If the rest is as promised, my family won't mind providing you the crafters and backing you need. But it seems as though a little rat is taking part in my resources. Chapter 951. Published at 16th of June 2022, 10:31 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 951. 12. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 951. 12. Augustus Ovaltine. One would have thought that he was a man of grand stature, the kind of man who could cause waves throughout an entire galaxy with nothing but a single word, the kind of man who would have an aura that made such a thing clear. However, while it was indeed true that he could flip the Milky Way on its head with a single thought, the rest wasn't true. In fact, he was very easily overshadowed by a few overbearing youths and seemed to be unmoved by it all. Even worse than that, causing chaos in the Milky Way might not even be so easy for him any longer, as the hidden undercurrents of this galaxy only became more and more pronounced. The man himself looked like a calm scholar. He wasn't stoic, and instead had an even smile on his face that made him seem warm and inviting. At the same time, though he wasn't short, he wasn't tall either, being under 6 feet tall. There didn't seem to be anything imposing about him in the slightest. He didn't even seem to care when this youth called him by his first name. This realization might have been shocking to many. The very man whose decisions even his own children feared actually appeared like this. But it was maybe those who could hide their thoughts so thoroughly that were the most fearsome. If you and your friends would like to take this as a hunt for sport, I don't mind. Consider Planet Solara your own grounds for as long as you're here. However, we can also deal with this for you so that your training is more free and unrestrained. The choice is yours. Augustus' voice was quite even and measured. He neither spoke too loudly nor softly. And, despite his ingratiating smile, his words had some backbone to them. It seemed that he was very much used to towing the line between servile and overbearing. The tall, shark-toothed youth thought for a moment before shaking his head. He looked toward the other youths that were by his side, but all of them had on an expression that said they didn't want to be disturbed. They had been the silently brewing undercurrent for too long, they didn't want to be restricted by anything any longer. It doesn't make much of a difference. We'll go ourselves. All right. Augustus nodded. The youths didn't seem to need much more than this and instantly shot out of the rest location, each of them using their own methods to deal with the heat. Very soon, there was no one left but Augustus and his attendants. Pull up what the scanners picked up. August spoke after they disappeared. Like an organized machine, the attendants began to move about. Soon, Augustus had several floating screens before him. How clever. The images were all too obstructed to get a proper view. Though they had still managed to catch Lionel because he had ridden a solar flare in, there was no clear image of him. But the time the images cleared, Lionel had activated refractive light, causing him to vanish. About the only things they knew were where Lionel landed and the initial direction he went in. Guild head, there are large movements nearing the core of the planet. It is likely that this individual has that as their target destination. Augustus nodded, his light smile not fading. Send out a few elite troops adept at concealment. Don't let anything happen to those youths. I don't want a single hair on their heads harmed. Yes. Guild head. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Augustus directly ignored the choice of those youth. In fact, he continued to monitor the situation, fully prepared to act personally should the situation warrant it. These youths were his key to reaching the next level. All of these petty squabbles and this internal conflict were nothing but pebbles in his way. He had been planning for too long to give up his piece of the pie. All these mysterious factions that were suddenly popping up within the guild he had built up with his own blood, sweat and tears. He would destroy them all one by one. Lionel wasn't aware that he had long since been discovered. But, as he had already decided previously, it hardly mattered to him. He had already come here prepared to be hunted. A disaster world provided a unique opportunity. Unlike a regular planet, even if they were aware that someone was invading, it wasn't necessarily a simple task to do anything. At the same time though, Lionel was aware that the closer he got to the core of this planet, the smaller the search radius would become, especially if they were already monitoring him. So, he still had to have some urgency in his movements. Lionel, who had been speeding through the curtains of lava like a bullet, suddenly came to a grinding halt. Erase the first. In this world, Lionel didn't even need to rely on the dictionary to find or deposits. His own affinities and sensitivities were enough, especially after entering the fifth dimension. He could sense things from hundreds of kilometers away as long as he focused, and that was only amplified in this world. This wasn't the first or deposit Lionel had come across, but it was the first that was worth his time because it was the first with a large store of fifth-dimensional ores. In fact, this vein alone was almost 70% fifth-dimensional. If the Milky Way Guild found this deposit, it would most definitely be a hassle. Not only would they need to establish a safe route to get to it, but they would then need miners who were strong and sturdy enough to both deal with the pressure at this depth and the ridiculous heat. As though that wasn't bad enough, digging up such ores came with dangers in their own right. Who knew when you would run into a fuel type or that would implode in your face and take half your body with it? But for Lionel, 12 minutes? Chapter 952. Published at 16th of June 2022 10:31 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 952. Rich, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 952. Rich Little Tali replied to Lionel's commands almost instantaneously. In one moment, Lionel was covered in a thin skin of silver. In the next, his hands had grown to over 3 meters in size from the base of his palm to the tip of his fingers. If one looked closely, it would even be possible to see Lionel's real hands moving about quickly, their fingers controlling Little Tali's every action. Lionel took a step to the side, stepping out of a rushing waterfall of lava and into a lavaless cave. His hands swiped at a side wall filled with what looked like sparkling rubies. However, instead of causing a loud explosion, the sound was akin to a hand running through sand. The large silver hand scooped out the hard rock as though it was nothing more than play putty. The marks of its fingers ran across the almost molten rock, revealing even brighter and more refined ores beneath. As Lionel got used to this unique method of using Little Tali, he grew bolder. Arms grew from his back and eventually he had 10 hands going at it at once. Each scooping out ores like they were no more tough than tofu. 10 is the limit right now, I can't stretch Little Tali any thinner. Lionel felt that his mind could handle controlling more of these large hands, but there was a limit to how large Little Tali could become. Lionel would have to help the little guy enter the fifth dimension first before he tried to increase the number of hands he was using. Knowing this, Lionel stored about 95% of the ores in the segmented cube and allowed Little Tali to absorb the rest slowly. He had to be careful with how he fed Little Tali, which was why the little guy couldn't progress on his own like Little Blackstar could. But, in this controlled atmosphere, Lionel was confident in monitoring things himself. Just as Lionel calculated, in just a dozen minutes, the cave was a completely hollow husk. Not a bad harvest, but the best ores here were only tier 3 of the fifth dimension. It would be great if I could find a few herb ore deposits and a devil's shavings deposit. Lionel shot away. He ended up coming across multiple herb ore deposits, but they were all of the fourth dimension so he directly ignored them. As Lionel dove deeper toward the planet's core, he found that the density of force was growing with every passing moment. Soon it became a bit suffocating to him. No, suffocating wasn't the appropriate word. It was more like intoxicating. Lionel felt that he was getting drunk? Lionel's brow furrowed. He knew that just because something was benign in small quantities didn't mean that it would always be so in great quantities or concentrations. People could even overdose on water and become high off of oxygen. It wasn't a large leap to say that this could happen with force as well. I've been passively practicing dimensional cleanse all this time, but it seems like that might be dangerous here. At least it might be dangerous if I continue like this. Let's adjust some things. Lionel was able to use his split minds to passively practice all the time. Thanks to this, he was already close to firmly stepping into Tier 1 after just a few weeks. But it seemed that the combination of his affinity for this place and the concentration of the force had left him with too much abundance, an abundance his mind couldn't quite keep up with. Interesting. Lionel had just finished fixing the problem and balancing himself out when he caught sight of exactly what he needed. He grinned from ear to ear. I'm rich. Lionel shot forward. Spiraling through the sea of lava, he made it to his target destination in just a few seconds. Bursting through another curtain of lava, dripping with red gold, his grin was almost visible beneath little Tali's skin of silver. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Soon, 10 massive hands appeared again, sweeping through the ore vein with impunity. Kilogram after kilogram of herb ore found its way into Lionel's pockets, his heart fluttering with the emotions of a nouveau riche. He had finally found his first fifth-dimensional herb ore deposit, and from his calculations, there was at least 1,000 kilograms of it here. It made his gains from his battle with Shield Cross stars look like child's play. It hardly took Lionel 5 minutes to clear it all out. After that, the deeper he went, the more frequent the deposits became. It was clear that the more dangerous the environment got, the less likely the Milky Way Guild would have sent people so far. However, Lionel did find one thing curious. Even at the more manageable mines, he had yet to run across anyone. On planet Vincero, he had had to skirt around several miners to avoid trouble, but he hadn't sensed a single soul in this place. Lionel didn't believe that it was because this planet was so much more dangerous. There would still be at least someone regardless of the danger. There had to be a different reason. Is a dangerous event coming soon? Or is there another reason they cleared everyone else out? Lionel planted a small seed of doubt within his mind, readying himself for any potential changes or danger. However, it was very difficult to dampen his mood entirely. In just an hour, he had accumulated over 8,000 kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb oregon. He could almost pay off his own bounty. This is it. Hours later, Lionel was finally beginning to feel some real pressure from this planet. At the very least, little Tali could no longer remain as nonchalant as the little guy usually was. Unfortunately, it still had a small ways to go before entering the fifth dimension, so it still had to put a small bit of effort in. Lionel, though, wasn't thinking about this exactly. Rather, he realized that the concentration of force had grown to such a level the first force crystal mine he had run across since Earth was now right before him. Lionel was certain that the Milky Way Guild had no idea about its existence, or else they would have stopped at nothing to mine it. But now, wouldn't it all benefit him? Not only was it wealth, but the concentration of force is great enough to form this mine. That should mean that the natural force arts aren't much further from here as well. Chapter 953. Published at 16th of June 2022, 10:31 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 953. Came to us. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 953. Came to us. If the concentration of force was already high before, it skyrocketed now. If Lionel had found this place while the segmented cube was still in its second phase, it probably wouldn't have been very long until it entered its third. Lionel stepped into the bright cave, his eyes practically glowing. Whether it was the walls, the ceiling, or even the floors beneath his feet, they were all covered by rubies with flickering silver flames dancing within them. The dichotomy of the two colors made for a fantastic sight and was quite beautiful to behold. This should be a special type of fire force. Oh, this. Lionel's pupils constricted. As beautiful as these crystals appeared to be, an instinct of danger took hold of Lionel's heart just when he thought of plucking one out. It took several moments of observation, but Lionel came to understand. This fire force is dangerous. For Lionel, who had the Scarlet Star Force as a ticking time bomb within his body, to actually say something like this wouldn't be just a small bit shocking. Of course, the character of this flame that was dangerous to Lionel wasn't the fire element itself, but rather a unique mutation that likely occurred due to this planet in question. And somehow, Lionel felt that this was just the tip of the iceberg. This tunnel formation is formed almost like it overflowed from someplace. Just looking around, Lionel felt it was standing at the mouth of something that had overflowed. By logic, then, there was likely a deeper, more concentrated region. Lionel traveled down the cave and sure enough, he found numerous perforations and holes leading to something far deeper. The unfortunate part was that his body couldn't personally fit in any of it. Maybe this is why they haven't discovered this place yet. It should be a relatively new formation. Maybe a few months at most. But that's surprising in its own right. For just a spill over of force to cause this, just what's on the other side? Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. Swallow it all, little Tolly. Asterisk bloop. In just a few moments, the budding force crystal mine had vanished, swallowed by little Tolliver entirely. Danger was all relative. It hadn't reached the point where Lionel felt the need to take a step back. Plus, these force crystals were just third-dimensional. The only reason Lionel bothered to have little Tolly swallow them was because of their quality and to also get the little guy prepared for higher levels. Bang! Lionel's fist shattered the opposing wall of the cave, expanding the perforations until they were large enough for him to fit through. The sudden change caused a violent energy to surge upward. It was the sort of boiling heat one might expect from an eruption of heated oil or a geyser shooting up and into the skies. Absorb it. Lionel redirected this wild concentration of force toward the segmented cube. In truth, Lionel wanted to form pure force crystals out of this odd fire elemental force. He had a feeling that this unique fire force might be the root to a powerful change within himself. His thoughts toward improving his snow star owl lineage factor had opened up another door for him. He had the greatest fire elemental affinity one could possibly have. Not only did he control the number one source of fire in the universe, but he also had it in the form of an innate node, the purest form it could appear as. With such an affinity, why was he constantly constraining himself to using normal fire force? Even if he couldn't control his Scarlet Star force just yet, weren't there powerful fire forces he could control? Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. And this one happened to catch his attention. If he was correct, he just might be able to complete his 4 seasons realm in a single sweep. And if things worked out how he imagined, there might not be anyone beneath the 6th dimension who would be able to match him. At least not anyone from this quadrant of the universe, that is. As Lionel dove down, the heat and pressure became greater and the warning signs for danger skyrocketed. But he pushed through, slicing through it all like a hot knife through butter. On one hand, little Tolly split apart the rocks and ores that blocked their way. On the other, the segmented cube sucked up the high concentrations of force in their surroundings. To Lionel's shock, even this amount of force wasn't enough to form even a single pure force crystal. To put matters into perspective, the amount of force Lionel had just passed by was enough to implode his body 1,000 times over. Yet, according to the segmented cube, he wasn't even a single % toward forming a pure force crystal. Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. He had been traveling for hours, his speed never letting up even as the heat became more and more scalding. In that moment, he broke through a barrier, only to find himself falling through a suffocatingly hot fog of air. Lionel felt as though he had entered a completely different world. All around, waterfalls of molten rock fell from on high. But what was baffling was that some of them seemed to be running in reverse as though they couldn't tell which way was up and which was down. This led to the odd scene of 2 waterfalls clashing together and yet being completely unable to eliminate the other. Instead, thin pools of hovering lava hung in the air where these waterfalls met, drawing a thin line that divided this odd world between a flip of up and down. The core? In the center of it all, what could only be described as a miniature sun stood, rolling with reds, golds and silvers hues. The thin pools of lava formed a disk around it, unwilling to approach too closely. Deep within this miniature sun's, complex runes of all kinds floated, pulsing with an undeniable power. This is it, oh? It looks like the little rat came to us. The sudden voice caused Lionel to blink several times. Chapter 954. Published at 16th of June 2022 10:31 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 954. Fog. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 954. Fog. Lionel, who was still falling through the air, sent his internal sight toward the one who had spoken. Though by extinct he still turned his head toward the sound of the voice. Lionel's senses took in the sight of 6 youths. They stood together on the thin pool of lava, a distance away from the miniature sun. However, it was clear that compared to Lionel, they were all having trouble of their own. The one who spoke out to Lionel in particular was wearing a massive set of black armor that radiated out with a strong shield that blocked much of the pressure from the others. At the same time, those that followed him were not only wearing their own armor, but they seemed to also be holding a glowing orbs in their hands. Those are force vessels. Force vessels were essentially artificial force crystals. They started off empty and had to be filled. And even when they were filled, they didn't have the purity of true force crystals, let alone pure force crystals. That said, in some places they were used as a replacement currency for herb Oregon. But these places were usually close-knit groups like families or organizations that specialized in particular forces that would benefit from a particular force vessel. It didn't seem that these youths were using their force vessels to accumulate wealth, though. Rather, it seemed that they were absorbing the pure force the miniature star was giving off. This force was so pure that it was just a single step from the sixth dimension. Lionel felt he didn't have enough information to guess what they were doing. But he believed it likely had to do with their training. He flipped through the air, eventually nimbly landing on his feet. Then he did something the youths could have never expected. He ignored them. The shark-toothed youth was at a loss for words when he saw Lionel look away from them, focusing his attention on the core of the world. Just as he was stunned, he finally put aside his sneer and truly observed Lionel. In that split moment of shock before his inevitable rage set in, he was stunned. Metal spirit. This close, there was no way he wouldn't be able to tell what it was that coated Lionel's body. In that moment, any rage he should have been feeling was completely overwhelmed by greed. And yet, just because he wanted to, didn't mean he could directly attack Lionel. For one, he was still responsible for the lives of those behind him. If these were all individuals from his own Midas family, that might be fine. But there were two individuals from the Radix family, one of which was his fiancée. Libli. He suddenly spoke out. Compared to him, his fiancée was practically a dwarf. He was 2.5 meters tall, but she was almost a full meter shorter than he was. Libli was the only one who hadn't reacted much to Lionel's appearance. Her gaze focused on her force vessel as she continuously calculated something. Don't. Libli spoke without looking up. Your chances of defeating him in this place are less than 1%. Your chances of taking his metal spirit in this place, even if you do so, is less than 1% of that probability. If you act, the likelihood the rest of us die will be over 60%. Libli's fiancé Dinmo almost reached out and picked her up by her scrawny little neck when he heard these words. But all he received was a slight glance from Libli before he felt his entire body go limp. Dinmo gnashed his shark teeth together, sulfur billowing out from his lips. Sometimes he really wanted to tear this fiancé of his from limb to limb. Of course, Libli was an absolute gorgeous beauty despite her petite stature. She fell just a single step behind the likes of Anya and Aina while also having her own unique air. But Dinmo didn't seem to care about this at all. As far as he was concerned, he was only marrying this annoying woman because his family said so. He didn't care for beauty as much as another man might. He was only worried about growing as strong as possible, and now this woman was standing in the way of him doing exactly that. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. A metal spirit wasn't just a crafting familiar. It was far more than that. Of course, making it more than that would pervert the path of the metal spirit and turn it into that world-devouring monster Lionel's father warned so much about, but why should Dinmo care? This was exactly what he wanted. Unfortunately, as scholarly as this petite young woman was, she was just as dangerous as him, and she hated to put her life on the line for anything less than 100% certainty. Knowing that, he knew that the moment her words fell, his chances at fighting Lionel here had dropped to zero. Dinmo snarled. Focus. The moment we leave this place, it'll be taking his head. From start to finish, Lionel didn't spare them another gaze, his internal sight having become enamored with the miniature sun before him. Dream sculpt. A scalding heating began to come off Lionel's skull. As though his mind was overheating, his veins reddened as blood pumped furiously throughout his body. The world began to rumble. The next wave is coming. Retreat. Libli said calmly. She finally sent a glance over toward Lionel, her eyes narrowing when she saw that he had no intention of moving. Was he a fool? Or, I see. A metal spirit truly might be able to weather this if his skill is high enough. Is he that confident? It might not be so simple to snatch it away later if that's the case. Dinmo's jaw clenched, but he still followed instructions. They had already experienced one of these eruptions since being here. He would have listened to Libli anyway, but after experiencing it himself, he had no objections. Lionel didn't move from his spot, his gaze growing a fiercer and fiercer light as universal force began to dance about him as though it had gained its own mind. A fog of death began to accumulate around him. Chapter 955. Published at 16th of June 2022 10:31 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 955. Found out if audio player doesn't work? Press stop then play button again. Chapter 955. Found out the core spun just a single degree. It was such a small change that with its size, it was almost impossible to notice. To a passive observer, it would have felt as though nothing at all had happened. Until, that is, the pulse appeared. In that moment, an invisible wave of energy spread out in all directions almost like a subtle calm before the storm. It expanded almost like a calm spring breeze. Even as it foretold the death of everything in its surroundings, it was surprisingly gentle for just a moment. Bang, bang, bang. The instant the invisible wave touched the thin pool of lava that hung like a ring around the core, it was like everything lost its form. What once was a solid, continuous stream of lava became unsettled droplets and volatile gases. Lionel was suddenly hit by a wall that sent ripples even through little Tali. It felt as though he had been smashed by a sledgehammer, the bones in his body threatening to shatter beneath the pressure. Valiant seal. Lionel roared, an illusory pillar appearing around his body, lacking in the earth elemental characteristics it needed to be complete. But in order to cast it so quickly, Lionel had no choice. It was one thing for little Tali to take the brunt of the hypercharged particles the core was releasing at this moment. However, the pressure wave was something that Lionel would need to withstand himself. It was then that the prowess of a two-star disaster world manifested itself in its truest form. Even after draining his stamina and layering 10 valiant pillars atop of each other, Lionel violently coughed up several mouthfuls of blood. And yet, his gaze never left the core, the fervor in his eyes growing to the point it became nearly manic. This pressure alone could eradicate someone at the quasi-sixth dimension. This was something that Lionel was absolutely certain of. However, he was in a unique position to withstand its impact. Firstly, the most dangerous parts, the heat and radiation, were all blocked by little Tali. That cut the lethality of the core's rotation by tenfold. That just left a small percentage of its destruction for Lionel to deal with himself, and yet he still felt his inner organs shake and quake. If Lionel wasn't so enamored by the natural force arts of the core, he would have realized just how large the gap between his current self and a quasi-sixth dimensional existence was. Though this was something the back of his mind was taking note of. That said, how long such a thing would last was still up in the air. I'll call you Radiant Fire Force, Summer, Radiant Core, Fall, a slow death, Winter, withering snowfall, Spring, golden drops. The radiance in Lionel's gaze only seemed to grow, the aura around him becoming thicker to the point even his auspicious aura began to leak outward. Bang. Lionel's hair whipped around, his body finally firmly stepping into Tier 1. His mind felt as though it had opened up to a new level, his split minds gaining a few 10,000 extra splits. Lionel exhaled a long breath, his gaze regaining its focus. He could feel a wild vitality coursing through his veins. Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. In truth, he hadn't thought the results would be so exaggerated. Ultimately, the Four Seasons realm was designed for the fourth dimension. He hadn't thought that it would empower him so much, at least not until he progressed into the heavenly body realm. But the results spoke for themselves. Lionel felt that his current self could defeat his former self with one hand tied behind his back. Despite the fact violent eruptions were still continuing all around Lionel, he almost didn't seem to notice. He looked around, realizing that this core was an exceptional concentration of not only force, but also force crystals. He could also sense several more herb or deposits from this location. Lionel grinned. Might as well take as much as I can until this eruption ends. There's huge devil's shavings and dancing lantern or deposits nearby as well. If all I have to do is gather star core in the future, that would make things far more convenient. Lionel shot out. By his calculations, he had exactly an hour. Across the universe, as Lionel was making dangerous maneuvers of his own, Aina moved like a prowling predator through the Luxnix family estate. Her body seemed to have lost its shape, snaking around trees and branches as though she was a formless mass of dark elemental energy. This odd phenomena made it so that the wind pressure she had to deal with was minimal, and despite having broken through the sound barrier, she hardly rustled even a single leaf around her. Her body control was immaculate and her stealth was even more fascinating. The Luxnix guards didn't stand a chance at detecting her before they found themselves being knocked out one after another. This choice was one of the most foolish ones Aina could make. She would have had a better chance at remaining unseen if she slipped by without touching them. But in that case, how would she fulfill her mission of being noticed? In a flash of darkness, she appeared before an inconspicuous building that looked no different from a storehouse. But, according to her information, Aina knew well that this place was one of the hidden entrances into the Luxnix dungeons. There was a main entrance within the family's main home, but there were also many hidden locations like this one. As for why a prison would have such a foolish design, maybe only the higher-ups of the Luxnix family were aware. Aina broke through the door with ease, only to find two guards waiting for her on the other side, their eyes widening in shock. But before they could react, a hidden blade had already shot forward, causing two heads to shoot up into the air. She rummaged through their bodies, finding the keys she needed and opening the doorway that led down a path of darkness. It was right when she took her first step downward that the blaring sounds of warning shook the Luxnix family estate. Before even laying eyes on Asen, Aina had been found out. Chapter 956. Published at 16th of June 2022 10:31 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 956. Scheme: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 956. Scheme. Aina hardly reacted, her steps remaining at the same speed, not accelerating or slowing. She dove down the stairs, her body still weaving in and out of the shadows. In just a few seconds she had made it down to the tunnels of the dungeons, her internal sight spreading out through the winding corners. With her curse suppressed so heavily, it wasn't difficult in the slightest for her to release such powerful pressure from her mind. In an instant she latched onto Asen's aura, slicing through the air as her powerful thighs bulged. In just another few seconds she appeared before Asen, who was in a half-daze. He had been drooling in his sleep when he was suddenly awakened by the loud blaring of the alarms. Now that a looming shadow had suddenly appeared before him, he was so scared that he nearly pissed his pants. He sat in his own filth, cradling his body amidst a pile of thick chains. His body trembled as he tried to make out Aina's face. But he only shivered more severely when he realized that she was actually wearing a mask. There was something particularly sinister about the way her golden eyes floated like two orbs of light within her black mask. Let alone pissing himself, Asen almost lost control of his bowel movements at the same time. Things only got worse from there because this shadow actually took out a massive red gold axe, only to swing down toward him with all the power it could muster. Asen screamed beside himself. Clang! The axe rebounded in Aina's hands. She felt her wrists almost snap beneath the pressure, her arms and legs trembling as her battle axe continued to vibrate. There were 3 small nicks that spanned 3 different bars resulting from Aina's strike. But outside of this there were no other great changes. A low shout left Aina's lips, violent universal force hanging around her. Asen watched on in horror as Aina's jet black hair spread out around her looking like the snakeheads of Medusa. He couldn't see clearly between all the darkness and the simultaneous blinding lights of Aina's force. It left him feeling as though he was walking to the end of a tunnel that led toward his death. Images of a rising moon caused the dungeons to tremble, a flood of universal force rising. Bang! The air itself shattered the moment Aina began to swing, the pole arm of her battle axe bowing beneath her might. The blade of her battle axe glowed with a fierce crimson light, her gaze being painted by a slight red. Like a hot knife through butter, Aina's axe tore through the bars, drawing a diagonal line from top to bottom and shattering the locking mechanism of the door. Asen's heart shook, finally completely losing control of his bladder as Aina's blade force passed just over his head and shoulder. In that moment he felt his life flash before his eyes. He swore that if he ever got out of this place that he would walk the straight and narrow. This was the most fear he had ever experienced in his life. In fact, it took him almost too much time to realize that he hadn't been harmed in the slightest. Before Asen could snap out of his shock and be thankful that he was still alive, Aina had thrown a ball of light toward him before he could react. The ball flashed a light and rebounded back toward Aina. When the light had faded, Asen had disappeared. This ball was a special vessel that could store life. But it would only last for half a day before it burst. In addition, it only worked on those with weak strength like Asen. Aina didn't linger, shooting off. However, she didn't travel far before she suddenly found her exit route being flooded by the Luxnix family guards. Her gaze turned a deeper shade of cold, her battle axe vanishing only to be replaced by two short swords. Her hair blazed to life around her, almost melding into the shadows just like the rest of her body. A fiendish, bloodied killing intent wafted from her body, the shadow of a looming panther forming over her head. In another corner of the Luxnix family estate, Gradier woke with an ugly expression on his face. After negotiations failed, he had been invited to stay as a guest. But now it was far too dangerous to stay here. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Without a word of explanation, he woke his entourage up one by one. Cut down anyone who blocks our way. Charge out. Gradier was too intelligent to not understand that he had been played. If he didn't cut a path to leave now, he might never see the light of day again. The worst part was that he knew his actions would only give those plotting against him an even greater chance of survival, but he had no choice. Even if the Luxnix family believed him and understood that he was being framed, it still wouldn't matter. For one, they might still detain him just to save face. Sometimes, the truth itself wasn't all that mattered. And second, Gradier was certain that this person who was plotting against him had his younger brother in their hands right now. What choice did he have but to help them? Gradier grit his teeth so hard blood leaked from his gums. His usual calm, stoic demeanor was nowhere to be seen. The worst kind of schemes were the kind that came and yet one still had no choice but to play along. There was only one bastard clever and cunning enough to pull this off. Richard, if a single hair on my brother's head is harmed, he'll tear you limb from limb. Blood and corpses littered Aina's surroundings. Her twin swords were like scythes of death as they flashed in and out of the shadows as though they had minds of their own. Dozens of fifth-dimensional existences fell before her. As for those foolish enough to take action at the fourth dimension, they were obliterated into a rain of gore and blood. Her speed didn't suffer. In fact, it only seemed to be increasing as she shot toward a pre-planned exit. Aina could feel that something had locked onto her. However, what was curious was that this person only seemed to be observing curiously, even up until the point just half a dozen minutes later when she burst out from the gates. Entering a dense forest, she almost completely vanished within. Yet, somehow, despite her concealment, Aina's steps came to a grinding halt barely half a kilometer from the gates of the Luxnix estate. Before her, a young man fluttering golden hair stood wearing robes of such pristine white that they glowed even in the darkness. For some reason, he had instinctually decided to chase after Aina as opposed to Gradier. He could smell that some conspiracy was afoot, but it was hard to tell. There was something else that felt off. He looked her up and down as though trying to understand something, the pressure he radiated making it feel as though there was no way out. Chapter 957. Chapter 957, Single Miguel stood in silence. After a while he became certain. This shadowy figure was likely not a plot set by Gradier. But this scheme was so great that it still didn't matter. What the truth was irrelevant. All that mattered was what the optics were, and only by dealing with them could his Luxnix family come out unscathed. Still, this was quite interesting though. Miguel didn't pay much attention to the outside world because there was no one of the younger generation even worthy of his effort. In fact, he felt that every second he spent in a sixth-dimensional world was another greater waste of his time. That said, as the heir of the Luxnix family, there were still some things he had to know, namely who the heirs of the other families were and what strength they had. This was all to say that an existence like Aina wasn't one he had heard of before. It was even more surprising that he would feel a slight pressure from someone who was merely a Tier 3 existence. Of course, he didn't feel that there was any real threat of losing, but it was surprising nonetheless. The Viola family shouldn't have such a genius on their side. And even if they somehow did, sending this person on such a dangerous mission was impossible. The only explanation was that this person wasn't a member of their bloodline lineage. This meant that this girl wasn't some hidden trump card of the Viola family but more likely to be a vessel candidate, or the offspring of a vessel. Reaching this conclusion, Miguel stretched out a single finger, his other arm clasped behind his back. Seemingly without warning or build-up, Aina's pupils constricted. A beam of light had already appeared just a foot from her face, leaving her almost no time to react. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, leaning backward, she shot one of her twin swords upward, her wrist going numb as the light rebounded away, leaving an exceptionally smooth hole in the bark of a tree. Miguel didn't say a word. He stood in the depths of the forest with a halo hanging around him. He looked like a spirit floating amidst the darkness, his outstretched finger releasing strength that could wipe out an entire city with ease. Each beam was highly concentrated, sending Aina onto her back foot almost instantly. In just 3 attacks, Aina had retreated 100 meters, eating up a fifth of the distance she had managed to put between herself and the Luxniks family estate. A coldness hung within Aina's eyes, a tinge of crimson still leaking out of their corners. Despite the increased distance, the strength of Miguel's finger lasers didn't seem to weaken in the slightest. In fact, they seemed to grow more powerful. Was he really trying to push her back to the estate so casually? Before Aina could even have this thought, she was pushed back another 50 meters, and yet Miguel had still not moved a single inch, his pristine white robes still fluttering. The subtle flapping of their fabric resounded between the clanging of metal and laser, accentuating just how quiet the forest was outside of their clashes. Another beam of light shot forward. It pierced through the trunk of a tree with a dull thwack sound and rebounded off of Aina's sword once again. This time, however, the collision was met with a sickening crack as Aina's wrist gave way. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. By this point, with how many trees separated the two, it was almost impossible to use their eyes to spot one another. However, each was very clearly aware of the circumstances of the battle. Miguel's finger lasers couldn't be stopped by these trees while Aina herself was still continuously being pushed back without recourse. In just a few exchanges, she had already been pushed halfway back to the family estate. If it wasn't for the trust the Luxniks had in Miguel to handle this situation on his own, it could be said that Aina would be finished by now. Aina's gaze hardly flickered as her sword fell from her hand, her broken wrist simply unable to maintain her grip. She suddenly flicked her forearm, snapping her wrist back into place only for it to be rapidly healed beneath her ability. Originally, she had been trying to focus on speed and stealth to get out of here. But, since even after all this time no one had come, it was likely that they would never. In that case, bang. A demonic howl left Aina's lips, a raging crimson force rising into the skies like a pillar. An illusory black-red flame erupted around her body and flickered within the depths of her golden eyes. Her left hand cocked back almost like a snapping whip holding on to her remaining sword. Just as Miguel's gaze narrowed, the whistling wind finally caught up to his ears and a glistening silver streak appeared right between his brows. Miguel tilted his head to the side. But he was slightly too late. 3 strands of his immaculate golden hair were tossed into the air, sprinkling downward without an anchor to root themselves to. Visit. For a better user experience this lineage factor. Where have I seen it before? Miguel never got the chance to answer his own question because Aina had already appeared before him like a she-devil, her golden red axe leaving blades of red in its wake as it struck down with a spine-tingling might. Aina's hair whipped about as though it had a mind of its own, the fiery red glow around her body only growing fiercer as her mind descended into a peak battle state. All she wanted was blood and the flesh of her enemy. Miguel stretched out his arm once again, a subtle change taking place in his demeanor. The output of strength was far beyond what it had been in the past. Bang. The ground beneath Miguel's feet shattered like an eggshell. All of Aina's strength weighed down from above. A moon hung high up to her back and her abyssal panther blood was surging through her veins like a raging river. And yet, it was still all stopped by a single finger. Visit. For the best no_vel_8_G experience. Chapter 958. Chapter 958. Aina didn't seem to truly register what had happened. Her body had entered a state of all-out battle. Steam rose from her skin, her heart began to pump 10 times faster, the radiant illusory flame around her only grew brighter and brighter with every passing moment. At the same time, the moon above her head began to revolve, the universal force projecting out from it growing with strength as its silver hue became a dripping blood red. Aina retrieved her battle axe, swinging down again with even more strength and power. Miguel took a single step back, his aura as stable as a mountain. Every swing of Aina's axe was met by a parry from his finger. His movements were smooth and natural, but anyone who was paying attention could tell that he was being forced to pour out more and more of his power. If things continue like this, she is going to end up killing herself. Though Miguel thought this, he made no moves to end this quickly. Something in his intuition was nagging at him but he couldn't quite place a finger on it. He felt that he had some sort of connection with this woman but he was unable to put it into words. Visit. For a better user experience however, this didn't mean he would go out of his way to save this woman either. As far as he was concerned she deserved death. If anything, the only reason she wasn't a corpse right now was because of his curiosity. That said, he could also tell that this girl's lineage factor was a self-destructive one and could be classified as a berserk-type lineage factor. It was harder to classify lineage factors in comparison to abilities as the former were far more varied, but there were still some broad categories that existed. This lineage factor of this girl's clearly placed great strain on her heart. At the same time, it ate away at her reasoning to the point she seemed to become a demon. In truth, it had been a long time since Aina fell into such depravity. The last time was in the Joan Zone when Lionel awakened his spear force to save her. Since then it seemed that Aina's berserk tendencies had vanished, but the truth was that she simply stopped using her lineage factor entirely. One reason was because she didn't want to put Lionel in that situation again. And the second reason was because she didn't want Lionel to see that side of herself. But right now there was only herself and this enemy. If she couldn't get past and survive, this would be the place she died. Unfortunately, Miguel felt like an insurmountable mountain. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel floated up to the surface of a river of lava, his body still coated from head to toe in a skin of silver. Everything about his actions seemed carefree and casual. One would have never expected him to currently be in an incredibly dangerous situation. But maybe it was just that wealth could mask a lot of things. Lionel had never been rich in his life. Though he had never been wanting for anything, when most of his life was spent in the schools of the children of celebrities, billionaires and politicians, it was quite clear that he would be inferior in this aspect. But right now Lionel truly felt rich. He had just mined locations the Milky Way Guild couldn't even dream of mining, and he had gotten away with. Lionel looked up, his lips suddenly beginning to twitch. Alright, maybe it was a bit premature to say that he had gotten away with it. In that moment, several auras had already locked onto Lionel. Up above, a massive force art that protected the entire planet was deployed, causing the skies to be filled with swirling runes that gave the world a unique character. Lionel coughed lightly. Maybe he had taken a bit too much time clearing those mines up. He wasn't sure if the segmented cube could burst through that force art. He would have to find some sort of weakness so he didn't end up exploding along with it. Lionel pulled himself out of the pool of lava, standing firmly on the land of obsidian. He could sense several auras converging toward him. They hadn't been certain of exactly where Lionel would appear. But now that he had come up, they could close the net around him. The smartest thing to do would probably be to wait for them to converge and then dive back down to appear somewhere else. But Lionel had a feeling that they were smart enough to be prepared for such a possibility, especially since there was already a group not even a half-kilometer from him. Visit. For the best no understanding he experienced, Lionel's playful demeanor vanished when he saw that group, his gaze narrowing. It was none other than Libli and Dinmo along with their group. Lionel didn't believe it was a coincidence that they just so happened to be here. He had heard the words of that girl earlier. Her calculations were more rounded and less precise than his own, but it was hard to tell if that was because her calculative abilities were weaker or if she had just been dumbing it down for Dinmo. However, regardless of the answer, the fact that she could guess that he would appear here was impressive enough on its own. This location had just experienced the strongest surge of charged particles and volatile lava under the most recent explosion. This made the force in this region chaotic and simultaneously meant that the force art that hung above this area would be the weakest and most prone to weakness. This was the second reason Lionel didn't just turn tail and reappear elsewhere. The fact that this Libli could calculate this matter was impressive indeed, and it made Lionel take her with a few measures of extra seriousness. Bang! Dinmo's fists knocked against one another. The sound alone made it feel as though one's ears might burst. However, just as he was about to take a step forward, Libli reached out a hand and stopped him. Visit. For a better user experience, I can tell that you aren't a simple opponent. But as you can see, this situation is not very favorable toward you. In as little as a dozen or 2 minutes, you'll be surrounded by fifth-dimensional existences and weaponry. I guarantee that even if we cannot defeat you in that time, we can definitely stall you for that time. So, how about we make a deal? Hand over your metal spirit and we will let you go without a fight before you're surrounded. Chapter 959. Chapter 959. Radix Cube. Lionel didn't answer Libli. In fact, he was still scanning the surroundings, trying to come up with the best plan of approach. The fact that Lionel was spending several moments to do such a thing should have been something these 6 youths tried to stop at all costs. However, they were still naive to just who it was that they were facing. There. Lionel's gaze narrowed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Libli's brows furrowed when she felt the subtle shift in Lionel's aura. It had gone from a slight tension to a relaxed confidence in just a few seconds. But she couldn't quite grasp just what changes had occurred in just those few moments to cause such a shift in him. Lionel suddenly began to walk forward, making the unease in Libley's heart grow. In one moment, Lionel was walking casually as though a man of silver. In the next, his back had suddenly exploded with two wings of blazing light elemental force. They spread outward for tens of meters, sparkling beneath the bright hues of planet Solara. Lionel's speed exploded, rippling air following in his wake as the obsidian ground beneath his feet shattered and cracked. Lava began to surge out from these cracks, pooling around and following the flow of Lionel's movements as though they had a mind of their own. Visit. For a better user experience, by the time Lionel appeared before Dinmo, just a split second had passed and a fist of lava following the arc of Lionel's punch was mere inches from the latter's chest. Dinmo's shark-like teeth glistened, his muscles bulging beneath his armor as he shot a punch out. Even before his fist collided with the punch of molten rock, a booming sound rocketed through the air. The power behind the strike of such a large man hardly needed to be described and could shake almost anyone to the core. Bang. Idiot. Dinmo shattered the fist of lava but completely neglected Lionel's real punch. In that moment, a spiraling universal force surged around Lionel's knuckles and his forearm, the twist of his hips and torso accelerating as he seemed to flash an entire meter forward in the blink of an eye. Before Dinmo could react, a fist landed on his plate armor. First it felt as though all the air in his lungs had suddenly been squeezed out. In the next, it felt like his ribs were collapsing in on themselves, turning his inner organs to mush. Then he shot out like a bullet from a barrel. The air screeched and whined as his massive body tore through it. It almost sounded like steam whistling out of a thin hole, the nagging high-pitched sound nearly enough to make one go deaf. Visit. For a better user experience, Libley to a single step to the side, dodging Dinmo's body as though she knew that exactly this would happen. But another Midas family member right behind her wasn't so lucky and ended up following their family heir and shooting off into the distance. It could be said that Libley was visibly annoyed. Lionel's fist of lava had only followed the arc of his punch, not enveloped his fist, so why did that fool think he only needed to block the bigger one? He was so simple-minded. Libley wanted to puke. Was this fool really going to be her husband? She heaved just thinking about it. Unfortunately, their two families had been attached at the hip since their very first generation. Their two heirs had always been destined to marry from the very beginning. From the moment of her birth, her marriage had already been decided. The worst part was that Dinmo was most definitely not so weak. Of course, he was only Tier 4, an existence that Lionel had already defeated many of. But comparing Dinmo to the other Tier 4 of this quadrant would be foolish. Lionel stood amidst the four remaining youths without much tension on his face. As things stood now, there were just two Midas family members remaining and two Radix family members. Yet, other than being annoyed, there didn't seem to be any other emotion on Libley's face. Is this the choice you're making? I can give you one more chance, she said plainly. In response, Lionel simply extended his opposite hand. A second flaming lava fist formed and opened to reveal its palm. It expanded to 10 times its usual size in an instant and covered the group in a shadow before descending downward like a falling meteor. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Libley's gaze narrowed, annoyance even more clear between her brows now. However, this didn't stop her from reacting quickly. Her small hands came together at blazing speeds, revealing a cube-like structure of complex moving gears and parts. In this way, it was a lot like the segmented cube, except instead of puzzle pieces, it was made of gears, screws and what looked like miniature hydraulic systems. To Libley, a metal spirit was far too important. If it was paired with her lineage factor and her Radix family's legacy techniques, it would be like adding wings to a tiger. Unfortunately, metal spirits were things she had only ever heard about in legend. Let alone getting her hands on one, she had never even heard of anyone partnering with one. She had wanted Lionel to give up because this would make things far easier. She could on one hand guarantee the metal spirit would fall into her hands while ensuring no other variables popped up. But since Lionel wanted to play this game, she would play. Libley's Radix cube floated in the air of its own accord. The moment she stretched a finger toward it, it reacted as though it had a mind of its own, sending out one of its pieces. Click, 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 click. In that instant, something absolutely shocking happened. A small pieces of bronze metal jetted out from Libley's Radix cube. First, it just coated one of her fingers, but then it began to rapidly unfold, snaking all the way up her arm before expanding outward. Visit. For the best no underserving experience in the blink of an eye, Libly's right arm was covered in a bronze armor 2 times too long and 3 times too wide for her. With a look of indifference, she pointed this steampunk-like arm into the air, shattering Lionel's lava palm into a rain of golden fire droplets with a single punch. Chapter 960. Chapter 960 Radix Cube. Though it was impossible to see with little Tali covering his face, Lionel's gaze had lit up like a Christmas tree. Libly's arm was the most complex piece of machinery he had ever laid his eyes on. Though Lionel could probably say the dictionary was more complex, he had never personally opened it up to see just what its inner workings looked like. However, this arm and especially the Radix Cube made Lionel feel as though he was a kid in a candy store, a reaction even he himself hadn't quite expected. Lionel didn't know when crafting for him had gone from something he just did to beat his father at to something he loved to this extent, but it had to be said that even he was surprised by this change. Though it might just be that his love for cool uniforms and things had spilled over. Because no matter how much he disliked Libly trying to take Tolliver away from him, he couldn't deny that her metallic arm was indeed pretty fucking cool. Libly's arm twisted and moved in all sorts of unique ways. Though it appeared to only had 3 main joints, the shoulder, the elbow and the wrist. Much like every other arm, its degrees of freedom were enormous. And somehow, despite its size in comparison to Libly's petite body, she seemed completely unaffected. What was most shocking about this though was the second Radix family member, realizing that Libly was getting serious, acted quickly as well, taking out a Radix cube of their own, and rather than attaching a single arm to themselves, their Radix cube fused into their bodies to form an entire armor as though they had become a mech. Lionel could tell with a single glance that this person following behind Libly didn't have a Radix cube even a tenth as complex as hers. But it still filled Lionel with awe. Very soon, though, Lionel wasn't able to continue to casually spectate. Visit. For a better user experience, Libly stretched her free arm toward her Radix cube, causing it to be coated in another arm as well. However, this one was far smaller and sleeker. It clung to Libly's small arms like a second skin and almost seemed harmless. Until Libly pointed it toward Lionel, that is. All the hairs on the back of Lionel's neck stood tall. Stay back. Libly said plainly to the others. This isn't a fight you can take part in. Go wake that fool up and tell him to stop being so useless. Even as Libly's words fell, a beam of bronze light tore toward Lionel, leaving him at a loss. Not only could he not tell what kind of force was coming his way, but it was actually so fast that his internal sight almost failed to lock onto it. Lionel's body curled backward in an arch, the beam just barely missing his chin. But by the time he tried to recover, Libly had already acted again. Her large steampunk arm whipped downward almost in a mock gorilla's pounce. It was so large in comparison to her body that its palm easily smashed against the ground even without her bending down. It propelled her forward with such speed that she had already appeared above Lionel even before the ground she smashed against registered the impact and shattered into countless pieces. Lionel's pupils constricted. The shadow of Libly's gorilla arm swinging downward toward him was ominous in and of itself. But the wind pressure was so great in addition to that he was nearly forced flat onto the ground, little Tali distorting slightly beneath her might. Lionel quickly rolled to the side, but the impact was far greater than anything he could have expected. Visit. For a better user experience, bang. Bang. The forearm of Libly's gorilla arm suddenly twisted and pulsed. The result was Libly's single smash registering like 2 as though she had layered 2 strikes atop of one another. The pressure blasted against Lionel's back, catching him off guard. Little Tali was blasted apart, revealing the skin of Lionel's back and sending him flying dozens of meters. Bloop bloop asterisk. Lionel's expression changed. The impact was only enough to redden his back a little and maybe bruise him a bit. But blasting apart little Tali was a different matter entirely. Little Tali was most spirit, as such the little guy could separate into many pieces and even change form at will. However, this didn't mean that the little one couldn't be hurt, which was why Lionel panicked. Thank God. Lionel sighed a breath of relief. Luckily, Libly's strike was a normal physical attack. So, though it blasted through little Tali, it didn't harm the little guy. It was only then that Lionel felt like he could breathe easy. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel slowly stood to his feet. It seemed he had been a bit careless. It was well known in the dimensional verse that a battle with force crafters would be the most unpredictable, and though he had been aware of this, he had still been caught off guard. There was no telling what other hidden mechanisms Libly could have within her arms. Alright, fair play. Lionel took a deep breath, putting little Tali away and gripping his fists. His aura blazed, bronze runes racing into existence across his body as his halo expanded and descended to his feet. As his halo rose up, a brilliant silver armor coated him from head to toe, his demeanor completely changing. He grasped at the air, a spear of black wood appearing in his hands as he faced Libly. Her radix cube continued to hover before her, her eyes having narrowed into near slits. She didn't care about having seen Lionel's naked body, but what she did care about was the glimpse of his face. You're Lionel Morales. I see. So you're from Earth. That makes things more interesting. Visit. For the best no_undershinji experience for the first time, Libly's face showed something other than indifference even as Lionel's head was slowly covered by a silver helmet. News had been spreading rapidly about this fugitive, but Libly still found it more interesting that he was from Earth. That said, Lionel didn't seem to care, his body flashing forward. He needed to end this quickly. Chapter 961. Chapter 961. Cutting Libly found herself feeling as though she was moving through a swamp. At first she had thought that Lionel's armor was just a simple change. After all, she could see at a single glance that it was constructed of just a few dozen parts. Compared to the complexity of her crafts and her radix cube, it was sorely lacking. It was almost like comparing night and day. Due to her innate biases, she had been lax even after it appeared. But the moment space seemed to solidify, her pupils couldn't help but constrict. What is this? Her movements slowed by at least half, and even though she didn't test it, she felt that even the range of her attacks had been cut by a long measure. If she had to describe it, it was like her sense of distance had been warped, as though 1 meter was now worth the equivalent of 2 before. And yet, while she was suffering through this, Lionel was completely unaffected. In fact, it almost seemed like the reverse to him. For him, 1 meter had just become half of that. The result was Libly feeling as though she was swimming through water while Lionel was cutting through the air at an unconscious speed. In a single blink, Lionel was already before Libly, his spear swinging downward with a violent momentum. Libly still reacted as quickly as she could. Her left arm, the one coated with the more skin-like armor, flashed. Her fingers moved about as though she was forming special seals that her radix cube quickly reacted to. The cube sprung to life, its gears and pumps emitting a wild steam for an instant before it expanded, forming a shield of spinning parts. Bang. Visit. For the best no_undershinji experience, the shield held strong, giving Libly enough time to stretch her arm out to the left. As though she had already predicted exactly what would happen, Lionel's body vanished and appeared right before her fingers, being met with a familiar beam of bronze light. However, what should have been an instant victory was met by nothing but a cold, heartless gaze. Libly hadn't realized that even as Lionel appeared, the flat of his blade would find a position right below her extended forearm. With just a twist of his wrist, Lionel sent Libly's laser shooting off into the distance, passing well over his shoulder. Libly's pupils constricted, her right arm whipping toward Lionel and causing the air to shatter and collapse even as barbed bronze chains shot out from their hidden mechanisms. But Lionel had already taken the initiative. The strength of the spatial lock increased. Even though Libly felt that she was spinning her arm as quickly as she could, it was moving at a snail's pace. The result was the activation of her chains being way off and missing Lionel entirely. Libly still managed to react quickly, her left hand once again forming several quick seals that turned her shield of gears into a royal sword of bronze that pierced down toward Lionel's neck. At the same time, she didn't bother to retract her chains, instead continuing to swing her arm toward Lionel as she used them as barbed whips. The dexterity with which Libly used her crafts couldn't be denied, and she seemed to have a quick answer to everything. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Lionel's spear had appeared before her forehead, piercing forward with an unquenchable thirst for blood. Libly could feel her life flashing before her eyes. At that moment she suddenly understood. Before the abilities of this armor before her, all her contingency plans and clever hidden traps were meaningless. What good was it all if she wasn't quick enough to use them? Bang. In the instant before Libly's head was pierced through, a necklace hanging from her neck automatically activated with its own mechanism, shielding her with swirling lights filled with spinning gears. Visit. For a better user experience still, Libly shot into the distance not much unlike her fiancé, her brain shaking within its skull. Even a fifth-dimensional existence wasn't immune from concussions. Lionel's gaze narrowed. That shield is at least sixth-dimensional. I can't pierce through that. He rolled his wrist. If not for his divine armor, he might have shattered his wrist during that pierce. Time to go. Lionel decided. In the instant before he killed Libly, he had sensed several auras suddenly pounce toward him. It was clear that they had protectors in the shadow, but the spatial warping abilities of Lionel's divine armor had caught them completely off guard, stopping them from reacting in time. Lionel couldn't help but be impressed. Their concealment abilities were actually good enough to hide from his senses. But now that they had exposed themselves in a panic, worried about Libly's safety, it no longer mattered. Now that he finally had room to breathe, Lionel quickly took out the segmented cube and entered its shuttle mode before shooting off into the skies. However, he had barely made it just 20 meters into the air before a rumbling took hold. Powerful auras converged toward him from all sides, the greatest of which was at Tier 9 of the fifth dimension. It seems they had finally caught up. Cutting it close, Lionel thought with a clenched jaw. Visit. For a better user experience across the dimensional verse, another battle was still taking place. However, it was even more one-sided than what had just been experienced. On one side, there Miguel with just a few beads of sweat falling down his handsome brows. They were so few and scarce that the wind quickly wiped them away, making it seem as though they were never there to begin with. On the other side there was a beaten and bloodied Aina. Tears and rips littered her flexible armor, matched well by the bloody holes that ran through her body. Large patches of blood stains littered the grass and trees, all signs of location she had once stood in. Every time she breathed, a crimson fog would escape her lips. It gave her quite a sinister appearance, but only the two of them knew that this crimson fog was none other than Aina's own vaporized blood. Her heart would have collapsed from beating too hard had she not continuously repaired it. However, even with all of this being the case, Miguel's eyes were drawn to the chip in Aina's mask. It exposed just a bit of her lower cheek, jaw and lip. But it was barely enough for Miguel to get an understanding of just how beautiful the woman before him was. Miguel brandished his thin sword, having been forced to take it out sometime within the last half hour. He could tell that as Aina grew more vicious, she was actually rapidly improving. In fact, bang! Aina's aura shifted once more, slamming through a barrier and spilling over into Tier 4 of the fifth dimension. Miguel shook his head. What difference did that make? Tier 3? Tier 4? To him, even such a watershed step was no different from simply fighting a slightly larger ant. He swung his sword again, ripping a huge gash from Aina's shoulder to opposite hip. Blood sprayed like a fountain, blooming in the air like a flower. The latest _sodies are on the website. Chapter 962. Chapter 962 shattered. Aina coughed violently, blood flowing out from her lips. But she had hardly finished when she swung down her blade again. It was as though her cough was just instinctive, but battle was all she truly cared about. Even if her body was on its last legs, she would still swing again and again. Miguel's sword snaked forward, attempting to parry it. He added a small bit more strength to his strike, taking into account what he predicted would be her boost in power. However, his strike hadn't even landed before his pupils constricted further. The moon to Aina's back suddenly increased in size. It gained rivers of blood and land of bones. It held a gravity of its own, shattering the ground beneath their battlefield and causing it to cave in. Miguel's steps faltered slightly and the pressure Aina's swing placed on his wrist caught him off guard, causing it to fracture. A light frown finally marred his face. Though indifference was still the greatest emotion, this change in him was equivalent to tidal waves in almost anyone else. Still, what he was most off-put by wasn't Aina's power, that alone was still like nothing compared to him. He was still barely using 10% of his strength. What was shocking was Aina's progress. Every time he felt that she had run into a wall, she burst through it. It wasn't only this, but he felt that she always seemed to rapidly adjust to his battle style. If it wasn't for the fact he didn't need to bring out his true abilities to fight her and was only casually and randomly countering, Miguel had the feeling that this woman might even be in a better situation than she was now. It was a baffling thought indeed, but this woman was definitely a genius of battle. Suddenly Miguel's pupils constricted. A trickle of blood fell from his cheek. It was so subtle that he almost hadn't noticed. The latest _sodies are on the website. Injured? Blood? Aina spoke for the first time. In fact, they were the very first words spoken between them. She continued to huff out fogs of crimson, her veins having practically been lit on fire. However, on her third huff, her mouth suddenly opened wide, twin canines that glistened with a pearly light reflecting beneath the high moon. Miguel felt a suction force he couldn't fight back against erupt from his very being. His pupils constricted as he finally unleashed his full strength. But, despite his quick reaction, a globule of blood half the size of his head was still ripped out from him in that instant. His expression twisted into a deep frown. If he had taken Aina as a serious opponent from the beginning, this would have never happened. His foreskin would have definitely blocked her attempt. But now he felt that he had been humiliated. Despite this feeling, though, Miguel quickly calmed, unable to do anything as Aina swallowed his blood entirely. As far as he was concerned, doing this was nothing short of a death sentence. Only he knew what his true power was. Someone else trying to swallow it would only lead down a single road. Aina couldn't read Miguel's mind, and even if she could, she was in a completely berserk state. There was hardly anything she could make sense of at this very moment. She swallowed the blood whole, instantly feeling as though her throat was being burned through. She shrieked into the skies, causing Miguel to shake his head. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. He had taken his time in this battle, hoping to understand where that feeling was coming from. But it seemed she would die before he got his answer. The truth was that he felt that he might never get an answer to begin with. He had already been fighting this woman for almost half an hour, and yet he hadn't gotten any clues. He was already close to losing his patience and just killing her anyway. Miguel was about to stride forward and take what was Aina's corpse away when he suddenly froze again. Aina's shrieks had suddenly come to a stop, replaced by sobs. The crimson had retreated from her gaze, rationality coming back to her person. Tears she couldn't seem to control fell from her eyes, pooling both beneath and outside of her mask. Aina's injuries began to rapidly heal. In fact, in the blink of an eye, she had returned to peak condition, something that left Miguel completely stunned. Not only had she survived, just how high was her blood elemental affinity? Aina looked down from the skies, her tear-filled gaze locking onto Miguel. "You're not him. Deserve death." The irrational words caught Miguel off guard. She had already wanted to kill him before, so why did this feel so much different? It was as though she had been snapped back to reality and hated Miguel for reminding her of something she didn't want to be reminded of. However, Miguel never got a chance to understand just what was happening or just what his blood reminded Aina of, because she directly lost consciousness, her body falling over as tears fell like a stream. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. Just when Miguel thought this might be an opportunity to take her away, a towering shadow appeared and slung Aina over his shoulder. His crimson eyes swept over Miguel before he walked by the air without a single care. Yet, from start to finish, Miguel didn't dare to do anything and could only watch them leave. His eyes narrowed. He had finally grasped where that feeling came from. The shadow soon made it back to planet Viola, entering a familiar estate before laying Aina onto her bed. Adoptive father. Yuri entered the room, laying eyes on Aina. Emil didn't look back. "Her defenses are the lowest they will ever be. You can do it now." "Yes." Yuri nodded without resistance, placing a delicate palm on Aina's forehead. This was indeed the best time. A year of patience had finally brought them to this point. Visit. For a better user experience, maybe someone else would have thought that a year ago would have been the ideal time, but Yuri's experience told her that this was the moment Aina's mind was the most solid. Time had proved her right. In these recent months, Aina had shown not an ounce of emotion. But the things without any give were also the things most susceptible to shattering. And now Aina had finally shattered. Chapter 963. Chapter 963. Emil watched in silence as beads of sweat began to fall down Yuri's brow. This matter shouldn't have taken so long, but after the curse was mostly lifted, Aina's mental strength had taken an impossibly massive leap forward to the point her previous and current power in this aspect could be compared to night and day. Due to this increase in strength, what Emil had prepared became impossible to use. Of course, Emil was surprised by the fact his daughter had found a method of dealing with this curse on her own when even he had no way to do so. But it seemed that even Yuri had no idea how this came about, and whenever he asked Aina about it, he would receive silence in return. The relationship between them as father and daughter couldn't be described so simply. They ate in silence with the exception of their clashing elbows. They hardly spoke to one another. And they would often meet the other with silence even if a question was asked. Clearly, whatever had helped Aina heal was something she didn't want to talk about. And at the same time, Miel wasn't a person who would insist on prying into the business of his daughter. She could do as she pleased so long as she also met his standards. As for what those standards were, they could all be described in terms of strength and power. As for anything else, he simply didn't care about them. "It's ready?" Yuri suddenly spoke. Miel nodded, his palm flipping over to reveal something that made the mansion quake for just a moment before settling back down. "Visit." For a better user experience, Yuri's gaze locked onto it almost immediately, but just as quickly she looked away. She felt as though needles were poking into her mind. Each one was several inches long, pressing through her cortex and reaching down toward her brainstem as though to obliterate all that was her. "Don't try to use your abilities on this. It's beyond our understanding." Yuri blinked, trying to regain her bearings. Though Yuri had only displayed her telekinesis in the past, this was just the very tip of her ability. Rather, it could be said that telekinesis was just a branching power gained through her powerful mind. The core of the truth, though, was that Yuri was not human. When Yuri's vision cleared, she locked onto the object again, her heart trembling with reverence. The object looked simple, but she knew that anything that could throw her mind into disarray was far from that. It was a tablet. It resonated with a bronze color and had words scrawled onto its front that Yuri couldn't quite understand, yet somehow felt the power of. Even in the darkness, it radiated a slight light of its own, shining as though it had its own light source outside of the moon and the stars. Just its presence alone seemed to have been rooted in some ancient past, and yet, at the same time, it felt to have a future that extended into infinity. "Visit." For a better user experience, it left one not knowing whether this was the relic of a past or something that had tumbled through the bounds of time and space to return to this age. For Yuri, someone who was from a race that was especially sensitive to the subtleties of objects, and was ironically quite terrible at doing the same with real people, this feeling left her baffled. "This tablet, adoptive father, this is the tablet I used to send you to Earth all those years ago. It can help." Yuri was baffled. How could this tablet have such an ability yet also be able to help Aina with her problem? She couldn't quite understand it. "There's very little I know about this tablet. But after having it by my side for decades, what I can say with absolute certainty is that it only really has one true ability." Yuri listened intently, hanging on Miel's every word. It was very rare for her adoptive father to speak so many words at once. This showed two things. He was definitely both nervous as to whether or not this would really help Aina or not, and at the same time he had a healthy respect for this object in his hands. "And that ability is that it breaks rules. It's that simple. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website." Yuri was stunned. These words sounded exceptionally simple, but they made her tremble from head to toe. The headache she received almost made her collapse. In fact, she would have had her adoptive father not caught her. Miel's sturdy hand pressed onto Yuri's shoulder, stabilizing her. Miel had a lot of faith in this tablet, but he was also apprehensive. If this tablet was so good at breaking rules, why is it that Aina had still had her curse after so long? Clearly this tablet had its limitations. And even further, since they had to wait until Aina was so vulnerable, those limitations only became more obvious. As much reverence as he had for this tablet and it playing such a large role in how he had come so far so quickly, he knew that relying on it completely and solely would only lead to a dead end. But now, he should be able to help his daughter. Over the next few months to maybe years, you will need to stay by Aina's side no matter what, okay Yuri? As her father, it is inconvenient for me to do the same. For all intents and purposes, Aina will become like a blank slate that needs to rebuild itself. If you want her to be the same Aina you know and love today, you need to let her grow and make mistakes on her own. This tablet will erase her memories? Yuri was shocked, instantly hesitating. "Visit." For a better user experience, no. But it will erase her personality. This is the only way to reverse what they did to my little girl all those years ago. As things are right now, her lineage factor is flawed and will always cause her to go berserk. At the same time, this flaw is stifling her other abilities from shining through as they should while simultaneously slowing her progress. This tablet will give her a reset and remove the flaw before allowing her to bloom forth once again. When her personality reawakens, she will be a force that can rule this dimensional verse with a fist. If Lionel had been there, he would have been stunned into silence. Removal of personality? Didn't this sound eerily similar to what his own silver tablet could do with shadows? Chapter 964. Chapter 964. Meet Lionel had no idea what was happening so far away, nor did he have any idea that Aina had such a flaw in her lineage factor. Oh, it should have been obvious. Lionel had fought a small number of Brazinger family members in the past, including one who had his life on the line, but none of them had ever gone berserk like Aina had. That said, it wasn't quite Lionel's fault that he hadn't realized this problem. Aina had only gone berserk a single time around Lionel, and it had been so long ago that he completely forgot. Of course, what Lionel didn't know was that Aina had purposely not used her lineage factor after that moment for fear of putting him in danger again. Even while seeking out the limit of her power, she was willing to handicap herself in this way. It was impossible to tell how many of such decisions Aina had made for the sake of her love of Lionel since she had known him. It seemed that even as a man with such a sharp mind, he was ultimately still a man, and Aina was ultimately still a woman who expected him to read her mind. That said, maybe of all the women in the world, Aina had the most right to expect something like this of her man, considering Lionel's abilities. But it seemed that Lionel himself was still not quite perfect enough. Lionel couldn't be worrying about this moment because he was suddenly being assaulted from all sides. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. His vessel shook and quaked as he rocketed into the skies, barely dodging beams of light and fire with subtle flicks of his finger. The more Lionel controlled the ship, the more he realized just how important his finger designation was for it. If he hadn't reached his particular level, controlling it would just be a pipe dream. The good news was that there was no one with the ability to fly, and the ships they did bring were slower than Lionel's own while taking away the flexibility they would normally have. As a result, Lionel was able to make it to the flaw he picked out long ago. At that moment, though, Lionel suddenly felt as though a gaze had locked onto him, making a cold shiver crawl down the back of his neck. His gaze narrowed, but he kept rocketing forward, shooting through an almost imperceptible gap and vanishing into the depths of space. "You want to use me, HM?" Lionel's lip curled. He could tell that whoever had locked onto him definitely had at least one method to stop him, maybe multiple. But they had chosen not to. Clearly, the only explanation was that he was more useful if he escaped. Lionel didn't seem to mind in the slightest. They say that the best schemes were ones that the enemy knew of and yet had to walk into anyway. But whether it was Lionel walking into this trap or Augustus, it remained that time would tell. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience. Libley's eyes opened, the images before her gaze blurring. Her head swam and her thoughts felt incoherent. It was clear that she was still suffering the most terrible symptoms of her concussion right this very moment, and it took her a bit to regain her bearings. When she did, her hand shot up to her forehead, a light frown marring her features. Looking around, she found that her head was actually leaning on someone's lap. She didn't know what to say when she realized that it was actually the big oaf Dinmo. He didn't seem to react to her waking up, seemingly finding everything but her face to be interesting to look at. Libley shook her head. It seemed this fool could be nice sometimes too, but he was still an idiot. She would have woken up long ago had he not insisted on leaving her on the surface of this terrible planet. Couldn't he have carried her away to somewhere cooler? Forget it, this was about the best she could expect from him anyway. The relationship between the Radix and Midas family had always been one of matching brains and brawn. Whenever it was that both clans had one female and one male heir in a given generation, they would always marry to strengthen relations between the families. It just so happened that Libley and Dinmo were both the heirs of this generation. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience. The Radix family and their calculative abilities. The Midas family and their fire control. Of course, things weren't so simple. Part of what made it so complex was that unique bronze force that even Lionel couldn't place or name. But maybe that was the sort of secret only the two families would know. All that mattered now were their two heirs had actually lost to a single young man from a fledgling world. It was more than just a little bit embarrassing. Of course, the two were greatly handicapped on this disaster world, while Lionel seemed to be even stronger here. But there were no such thing as excuses in the matters of life and death. Today they had been lucky, but what about next time? Libley rose and narrowed her eyes. This was what they had come to this galaxy for. They had already conquered their own galaxy, but there were no more growth opportunities left there. If they wanted to reach the next level and enter the stage of the true powerhouses of this universe, these were exactly the challenges they needed. As for Lionel, she hoped that they would meet him very soon. After all, much like everyone here, they were all eyeing the same world and the same fold of reality. Soon enough, so long as Lionel would fight on Earth's side, they would meet on the battlefield once again. Visit. For a better _user experience. Days later, Lionel's ship circled around a particular planet before descending. This time he didn't have any great hassle to go through, as this was a world that emphasized the lack of exactly that. It was yet another merchant hub with fairly loose restrictions. For the first time in almost a year, Lionel would meet up with Elther. Chapter 965. Chapter 965 Addicted. Look at you, you're still as pale as ever. Lionel let loose a laugh, sitting opposite Elther, who was caught off guard by his sudden appearance. Toward such words, Elther could only be speechless. He might have already taken out his saber for anyone else who had said these words to him, but for some reason he found it quite amusing when Lionel said so. It wasn't much of a surprise that Elther's pretty face and seemingly sensitive skin was a sore spot. He wanted to be a general, not a male model and gigolo. Yet, he looked like the slightest bit of sunlight might leave him red the next day. It was a sad plight indeed. You're one to talk. Have you seen your hair lately? If it wasn't so short, I'd mistake you for a woman. Elther's mouth was just as sharp as his blade though, so he hardly missed a beat. Lionel grinned. Oh, this? You don't think it makes me look quite kingly? Elther snorted. A king of solely women maybe? The latest _p_sodies are on the website. Even as he said the words, Elther knew that his retort was quite weak. Unfortunately, he just felt that Lionel's hair quite suited him, so it was a bit difficult to lie with a straight face. Annoyed by his failure, he just looked away, calling for a waitress to order a large sum of food he had every intention of making Lionel pay for. Lionel laughed, seemingly seeing through Elther's thoughts. Though the two hadn't known each other for long and could really only be considered to have had two real interactions, Lionel felt that he had quite a good read on Elther. He was a man who wanted to be seen as a man first and foremost. But he still had a lot of childish tendencies. That said, whether one could make him display these tendencies would both be dependent on how much stronger than him you were and just how close to him that you were. If someone was stronger than him and also not someone he recognized as family or friend, he'd be more likely to lash out than retort like he just had. At that moment, the two men shared a private room in a top-class restaurant. Lionel hadn't really cared where they met, but Elther insisted that a king should have some standards. Of course, Elther also complained about Lionel's choice in clothing, claiming him to be far too casual. But in the end he was forced to give up and take it one step at a time. It was already enough of a miracle that he got Lionel to come here. The man wouldn't even touch a drink usually. Clearly the irony was lost on Elther. He wanted to be a general, but he was always so concerned with his clothing. Visit. For the best no experience. So, how are things going? Lionel asked as he was halfway through a beast carcass half the size of his body. The movements of that woman I told you about are quite weird. She keeps attacks and claiming periphery territories of the guild, but has made any real moves toward the guild itself. It's almost like she's stringing us along. Oh. Lionel blinked. Show me on a map. Lionel used the projection ability of the dictionary. Usually he used it to navigate through the Milky Way. But this was an excellent use as well. Elther reached his hand forward, pinching his fingers before spreading them out wide. The result was the 3D plane of stars zooming in toward a certain location. We've attacked here, here and here. In these months we've fought 3 major battles. The rest of the time has been spent consolidating territory and securing routes. Lionel's gaze narrowed when he saw these locations. He had already memorized the map of the guild's territory that Elther had sent him previously, so he knew exactly where these were and what they represented. But that was also what made it all so fascinating. None of these territories were very valuable at all. The best asset here was a lower-level disaster world called Planet Istia. However, it was quite old and had already reached the end of its potential. Other than being a decent place to gather lightning element ores and herbs, it wasn't very useful. Visit. For a better user experience, the other 2 locations were just normal trade routes, asteroid and moon stations, along with planetary hubs. But the thing about these trade routes was that they led to fourth-dimensional world and folds of reality. Their use in the grand scheme was minuscule at best. The good news about this was the resistance the Oryx met was minimal, while also giving them a chance to learn how to work like a real army instead of a bunch of powerful individuals like they normally did. But the bad news was that Lionel couldn't see through to the purpose of this woman. This wasn't a feeling Lionel liked. He was normally able to read people quite well, but he had yet to meet this woman, nor did he understand her connection or beef with the Milky Way Guild. At the same time, he couldn't make heads or tails of her actions either. Interesting. Lionel continued to look at the map, thinking of several possibilities. But he realized that he was missing too much to see things on as large a scope as this mysterious woman. The more he thought about it, the more curious he became about just who she was, and the more aware he became of just how little information he had. Though he had a verbal deal with Hephaestus and Ray Lion, there was no telling if they would succeed, or even if they did succeed, just how long would it take them to do so. Unfortunately, that left Lionel flying quite blind. I bet Shield Cross Stars has a lot of information. This singular thought began to brew some less than savory thoughts in Lionel's mind. It seems that he had become addicted to being a madman. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. Chapter 966. Chapter 966. A Union. Elther quickly caught Lionel up on a lot of things. Eventually, the topic came back to Lionel's teammates and the matters related to Earth. Lionel had learned a while ago that Earth had successfully entered the fifth dimension and had recalled a lot of individuals as a result. Of course, this had happened while Lionel was within the dimensional cleanse trial world. So, he hadn't gotten whatever this message was. The wristwatch that had followed Lionel for so long had long since been taken off his wrist ever since he was able to control little Tali without the use of force crafting gloves. However, Lionel hadn't destroyed it and just left it within the segmented cube. So, after he returned to the Milky Way, he too received the messages. Ultimately, Lionel had just left his brothers to train and grow as strong as possible in his absence, so returning to Earth wasn't a bad thing. After all, there was clearly ample opportunity to grow stronger, as silver zones might begin appearing at any time. However, whether it was smart to enter those zones as of now was still up in the air. Regardless, bronze zones were an excellent chance. Not only could they hone their skills, but they could still receive rewards from higher-level worlds. Even Lionel, who was a bronze crafter himself, if his spears were ignored, only had a couple bronze crafts. So, this was a great opportunity for them. Now that Lionel didn't have to worry about Aina, at least not immediately, he didn't mind returning to Earth as well. After all, as far as he was concerned, there'd come a day where Earth was the center of his territory. He had to do his part to protect it too, even if it was under the control of his grandfather for now. Yes, there's a lot of good opportunities on Earth right now. In fact, they have been contacting me with methods on how to deal with it all. It all? Lionel was taken aback. Yes. The main problem Earth is facing right now isn't the zones, those have slowed to a lull after the breakthrough. The main issue is the evolution of the oceanic creatures. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Earth never had to deal with much of an invalid problem because Emperor Fox had cruelly chosen to kill over 99% of Earth's population before the metamorphosis even began. But there was nothing even he could do about the vast ocean. Visit. For the best no_vel_id_ng experience. In fact, this made Lionel wonder. Long ago, Earth had gained great enough terraforming technology to fuse the continents into one. He wondered if that was a coincidence or by design. Maybe his grandfather always knew that the ocean would be their greatest obstacle. Still, something about the movements of the galaxy made Lionel feel that the ocean was still the least of their worries. At the same time, he also wasn't very confident in fighting in the water. At the very least, he had no experience in such a thing. That said, he had two solutions to this. He could use his water domain spears, and he could also create some crafts to counter the ill effects. Either way, he would need to assess the situation first when he returned to Earth. I think that's everything, Elther said, exhaling a breath. Lionel nodded slowly. How receptive do you think they would be to a human leader? From the way I see it, they follow the direction of that woman just fine as long as they see what they're getting out of it. But it's hard to tell. They aren't subservient. It's a subtle difference between being employed and being loyal subjects. Whether or not they would continue to follow you is impossible to say. Lionel nodded in understanding. This might be a bit of a delicate issue, and it might be better if he made himself known to them sooner rather than later. All right here. Lionel tossed a spatial ring over to Elther. But when he saw what was inside, his eyes almost popped out of his sockets. How did you gather so much herb or visit? For a better user experience, Lionel grinned. You could say I procured them. Lionel didn't explain, his smile beaming as he rose to leave. Use this to fuel their advancements. Don't be stingy. I want all of that money gone within the next month. Month? This is a lifetime worth of money. Elther was left speechless. He was the prince of a kingdom. It wasn't as though he had never seen such wealth before. But this amount was the equivalent of what his Oryx kingdom would spend in an entire population of millions in a single year. Yet, Lionel wanted him to use it on 10,000 Oryx in a single month. If he wasn't a madman, then what was he? They'll replace it soon enough. After all, I have a feeling that the beast crystals of Earth's oceanic creatures are quite rare and valuable, right? This? Elther didn't know what to say. But he never had the chance to before Lionel suddenly vanished. He's growing more powerful. Elther gripped his fists. He was lagging behind. He needed to raise his effort. Visit. For a better user experience in another corner of the galaxy, back on a familiar planet Luxnix, a young man strolled out from a forest, entering the estate once again. He looked around at the dead bodies littered around him and shook his head. It was unfortunate that this had happened in this way. Maybe he had been too careless. If he had known that she had come with such backing, he wouldn't have been so casual about it all. But he had thought that the Viola family would have been too scared of escalating the situation to this point. The action of sixth-dimensional existences means something completely different from just fifth-dimensional ones. None of this was what took precedence in Miguel's mind. He glided through the estate, making it to a particular place. Yes, Elder. I'm just here to meditate for a bit. The guarding elders nodded. Of the younger generation, there was only one allowed to casually enter this place. Miguel descended down a network of tunnels only to find himself standing before an altar. And upon this altar, there was yet another bronze tablet. However, this one was different from the one Miel held. Sitting upon a marble platform, a translation was etched into the pedestals of this one. A union of light and darkness will reveal the 12-pointed star. The light character exuded an aura eerily similar to Miguel's own. As for the darkness character, Miguel had finally realized that it reminded him of Aina. Visit. For the best no_vil_understand experience. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.